welcome back everybody to day 2 of our 2022 ASEC virtual workshop, Electrify Everything, and exclamation point, question mark are, the punctuation is very important in this title. So we're here today sponsored by the Alaska Center for Energy and Power, and I am Michelle Wilber. Thanks for joining us. I hope you were rocking out to the elevator Bob Marley as much as I was. I'd like to start off today by acknowledging that I live and work on and am joining today from Anchorage, which is on the traditional lands of the Dena'ina Athabascans. And this is land which they have stewarded for thousands of years. I would like to express my gratitude and respect for this stewardship and for the past and continuing innovations and perspectives of the Dena'ina. And I also want to recognize that others are joining from other lands, and I want to extend that gratitude and respect to their Indigenous people as well. So with that, as we shared yesterday, this series of 4 virtual workshops has been held monthly free of charge leading up to the Alaska Sustainable Energy Conference happening in person May 24th through 26th at the Dena'ina Center in Anchorage, Alaska. There are both in-person and virtual tickets still available for the conference, so hopefully you'll consider joining us at this inaugural event. I'm really looking forward to it. Should be a good time. In-person and virtual tickets can be purchased at www.alaskasustainableenergy.com. The first virtual workshop we held, Nuclear Energy in Alaska, was in February. The second was Ocean and River Energy in Alaska, held in March. The third was Hydrogen in the High North, which was held in April. And today, our incredible lineup of presentations and panelists continues as we explore perspectives from both utility and industry in beneficial and equitable electrification. So the agenda is up on your screen right now. We're starting off today, as you can see, with our welcome back and our keynote. Then our first panel, which is a utility perspective sort of fireside chat panel, moderated by economist Steve Colt, will begin at 9 a.m. Then we'll go into a break and we will come back with our industry panel, which are folks representing technology solutions that are on or soon to be at market to help us with this transition. And then we will wrap up for the day and for the workshop. So we really appreciate you being here. We are going to kick off with a little activity to get your blood going, make sure that coffee has hit your brain. So we have a poll. Today's poll is really just for fun. You could go to pollev.com, TOTTAK216, that's in the chat, or you can participate by phone by texting TOTTAK216 to 22333, and then you'll receive a text message once you've joined the session, and you can type and send a response that will pop up. So for this first activity, we want you to share with us what electrification technologies you have adopted in your life. So there are some options: electric vehicles, heat pumps, induction cooktop. Obviously, there's a lot of different items that a heat pump could be in. You could have a heat pump dryer or a heat pump heater for your home, space heating, or a heat pump water heater. And there's another category as well. So I'm seeing that a lot of people today, and again, this is just for fun to get your blood going, but we've got a lot of folks with electric vehicles, 42% of respondents. That's great. And then some heat pumps and a few induction cooktops. Awesome. Very cool. Well, thank you so much for participating in that poll. Oh, other is polling ahead. I wonder what's in the other. Maybe we'll get some of that in the chat. So, and feel free to put other in the chat if you'd like to share and talk about this a little bit. But we'll move into a little bit of housekeeping items. So please introduce yourself in the chat. Let us know your name and the organization you're from, and then feel free to talk more about your own electrification if you'd like to. Our presenters have created presentations to be as engaging as possible. So please continue to participate in the polls as they come up. Actually, that was the last poll, but submit questions via the chat, join in various activities that the presenters have planned. So we really welcome your strong participation and feel like you're part of this conversation we're having today. If you have any difficulties with audio or trouble viewing the presentation, please send a direct chat message to event support for assistance. Hopefully that's working. If not, feel free to send it to moderators and speakers. During the workshop, all attendees will be muted. You may submit questions or comments by using the chat feature. I will say there is both a Q&A and a chat feature, and we've been doing a little bit better job responding in the chat feature. So you're welcome to use that Q&A, but the chat is working well if that makes it easy to just stay there. The moderators will read questions to the panelists at the end of panels when there is time to do so, and otherwise, we're encouraging our participants to respond to questions in the chat, and certainly you're welcome to have conversations with each other in the chat as well. A recording of the workshop will be available at the ASEC, that's Alaska Sustainable Energy Conference website at www.alaskasustainableenergy.com/virtual-workshop at a later date. Please continue to check back for more information, and we're glad you're here with us live today. So first of all, it is my pleasure to introduce you to this morning's keynote speaker. I am very excited by this. As I said yesterday, our group name up here, the Alaska Center for Energy and Powers Initiative, is the Beneficial and Equitable Electrification Group. And we believe that equity is a huge part of this energy transition. And I am a little embarrassed that that may not be as well represented by our main panel speakers. But Anjali Jane Figueroa will hopefully help us put some very needed attention on this piece of our energy transition, excuse me. So she is currently an AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow. She's working in the DOE's Office of Economic Impact and Diversity, focusing on energy and environmental justice. Previously, Dr. Jane Figueroa was Associate Director at Green Info Network, which is a nonprofit that specializes in mapping and geospatial data analysis in the public interest. Dr. Jane Figueroa received her bachelor's from the University of Michigan, that's a BS, and an MS in Technology and Policy, and her PhD in Civil and Environmental Engineering from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Dr. Jane Figueroa's academic research focus has been the food, water, energy nexus. Her current work focus is on Justice 40. Dr. Jane Figueroa has worked in the private, academic, nonprofit, and now governmental sector, and enjoys comparing their unique solutions to similar problems. So please join me with a very warm welcome for Anjali.
Thank you for inviting me. As was mentioned, I'm a fellow right now at the AAAS and working in the Office of Economic Impact and Diversity. And in today's presentation, I want to touch on 3 topics. One is an overview of energy justice and equity and why that equity lens is necessary. And finally, the Justice 40, which can be a framework for a just energy transition. And in order to have a common baseline, it's useful to define some key concepts. So if you're not from the energy and environmental justice world, you may not know or be familiar with these terms. So environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, income, or wealth. And it has to do with respecting the development, implementation, enforcement of laws and regulations and policies, and usually can be construed as having 4 pillars. And these pillars are useful because they encourage us to ask certain questions. For example, what is the decision-making process like? How transparent is it? Who is included? And this reflects the perceived fairness of the process. We can ask, how do we allocate or distribute the resources or products? Is it by need, opportunity, location, merit? And does this reflect the perceived fairness of an outcome? How or who in the process is given respect or recognition? And this reflects the perceived fairness of treatment. And all of this, of course, happens within a certain context of a specific location, a specific history that may have environmental or social harms. So recognition that we're not exacerbating those, and perhaps even going as far as repairing those, is crucial in the lens of an environmental justice. So energy justice is similar. It refers to the goal of achieving equity in both the social and economic participation of the energy system, while also remediating the social, economic, and health burdens on marginalized communities. And energy justice really, it centers the frontline communities and aims to make energy more accessible, affordable, clean, and democratically managed. Because it explicitly centers frontline communities, it really brings together 3 concepts. One is the energy justice, the other is the environmental justice, and also climate justice, because as many of you are working on climate change, you know that marginalized communities are the ones that will be feeling some of the changes most drastically. The concept of energy insecurity is the inability to adequately meet household energy needs and includes physical, economic, and behavioral dimensions that lead to adverse health issues. And oftentimes energy burden, which is the percent of income that's devoted to paying for energy, and this can be heating or cooling, can be a metric of energy insecurity, with usually the cutoff being 6%. So those paying above 6% of their income being considered overly burdened. And so what you're seeing here is that 1 in 3 Americans households face energy insecurity and have high energy costs. And this comes from the EIA, US Energy Information Administration, and the Residential Energy Consumption Survey from 2015. So it's affecting enough people that it is a consideration that we should take into account. And what's more is that these energy insecurity correlate with specific demographic characteristics. So if you look at this chart, you'll see that people that are lower income, those that have children, those that are older, those of particular race, in this case, Black or Hispanic, tend to have higher energy insecurity. And this starts showing that there's an inequitable system. And households of color usually spend a higher percentage of their income on energy. And so that shows the energy burden being the metric for energy insecurity. What that means is that our energy system as it currently is inequitable. And we can look at that in a few outcomes that have happened. So one is pollution. People of color face higher levels of pollution. And this, of course, is related to health issues that result from either fossil fuel burning or generating assets and where they're located, usually in less affluent areas. And usually communities of color are exposed to a lot more pollution than they produce, while white communities are exposed to less. And this has to do with regional differences, both in terms of where people are located, but even after you control for income, this is still coming through. So it's not just a question of affluence. There's another structural vulnerability in renters. So renters, oftentimes these are also people of color or frontline communities, face increased number of outages and more prolonged outages. So here, this is an example of that confluence of climate change and impacts, as well as outages. This is the February 13th cold snap that happened in Texas, where a lot of families were unable to heat their homes. And you can see how long the outages lasted. And this is particularly in Harris County. The share of renters had much longer duration before their households were brought back online. And so this discrepancy between renters is an additional inequity in our current system. And this issue with renters actually also is a barrier for accessing electricity, particularly modernization programs or things like rooftop solar. So the potential for rooftop solar is higher on single family rooftops. And then the adoption of solar, already controlled for income, is lower by groups that are Black or Hispanic. And so what we're seeing is that these discrepancies really limit who can participate in some of the goals for electrifying or moving the energy system into a renewable system. And if we don't tackle them up front, we might just be repeating a cycle where we have some of these inequities embedded again. One example is the ability to finance distributed energy. It particularly constrains low-income groups because the way that the financing is done requires, for example, a credit score or a debt-to-income ratio, and this can be a barrier to low-income consumers. They may not qualify for the tax bracket for example, a solar tax credit or any other program. Tribal entities or nonprofits can't access it with a direct payment option. And renters, as we discussed, have more difficulty participating because of split incentive. The decision, for example, to participate belongs to the landlord, whereas the person that's benefiting would be the renter. And so these types of split incentives or poorly designed programs can really trap groups. And that's really what we're looking at as being the challenge. How do we transition the energy system while ensuring that it is equitable and just, so that it works for everybody and so that it can move away from some of the fossil fuels? And this is something that we have to think about. So when we look at Justice 40, I think Justice 40 can be a useful framework to think about this just transition. So let me discuss a little bit of what is Justice 40. Justice 40 really comes from an executive order, 14008, which is tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad. And this particular section looks at how federal investments might be made such that 40% of the overall benefits flow to disadvantaged communities. So trying to interpret this is part of what the Office of Economic Impact and Diversity is trying to define. So there's 3 buckets: federal investments, 40% of overall benefits, and disadvantaged communities. What we went through was an effort to identify what we care about when we talk about J40 and policy priorities. And so I mentioned energy burden, and that is our first priority, looking at how to decrease energy burden. We talked about pollution and environmental exposure, so we want to decrease pollution and environmental exposure. We want to increase parity in clean energy technology and access. We want to increase access to low-cost capital. We want to increase clean energy enterprise creation and contracting, clean energy jobs, the job pipeline, the training, make sure that we have energy resilience so those outages aren't as long, and then ensure energy democracy. So these are the outcomes that we would want. And part of the design is how do we get these to happen? So currently, we have about 75 programs across 19 offices that would be covered under the definition of J40. These are programs that work in one of these 7 areas: climate change, clean energy and energy efficiency, clean transportation, housing, training, pollution remediation, and clean water. And so we can look at the 3 buckets. So this is looking at what federal investments count. Many of them in DOE count. We have to define disadvantage, and this can be tricky. So right now we have 2 definitions. One is the DOE's working definition, which looked at 36 indicators and looked at cumulative burden across these indicators to identify specific census tracts that would be disadvantaged. And we're showing a preliminary map of that. And then we have an additional definition by the White House. And so currently looking at what definition should be. And that encourages the community to come in and give feedback as to whether that definition is accurate. And then the final part is figuring out what is a benefit. How do we measure this? And these are examples, for example, for energy burden, which we can measure directly from income, from emissions, for the job pipeline, for the enterprise creation. These are all supposed to be things that are related to those policy priorities that are actually measurable and that the department could go out and measure. They can be positive or negative. So we want to ensure that if a harm is going to be created by one of the programs, that we can also measure that. And then they should be able to be mapped to these disadvantaged communities. And so we ran an attempt at looking at how we would do this in DOE. We had 18 program offices with those 63 covered programs, and they submitted and tried to see how we would structure this and be able to map them and measure those benefits. And right now, we can show that about 44 of those covered programs are having a program that at least benefits one DAC, but we also have a long way to go because many programs can't tell you where their investments are actually going. And you can see some of the benefits that we care about, for example, clean energy access, are still not being measured or reported. And so this is just the framework that we're currently working on. But to give you the takeaway, what we really have is a unique opportunity. We need this just energy transition, both from pressures from climate change, but also if you look at it from an equity lens, the system isn't working. The J40 team and this kind of construction of J40 is really a way to coordinate DOE's efforts, but it's also a way to start thinking about it. How do you measure? What do you measure? Where does it go? It's a place-based attempt, which really looks at location, and it shows us that it is necessary to understand the social characteristics. So I'd mentioned the different demographic problems that are impeding participation. And these really should be guided by what I started, the 4 pillars that help us ask those difficult questions and that allow us to have a process, a recognition and distribution of benefits that are both restorative and that encourage more participation. So with that, I went kind of quickly, but I hope I finished in time.
You finished with plenty of time, Angelise. Thank you so much. We have so much time before our next panel that if you're open to it, maybe we could take a question or 2 from the audience.
Yeah, that would be great.
And I do see one in the chat already. Our own Nathan Green asks if there is a list of all disadvantaged communities available online.
Yes. So on our website, and I'll put it in the chat, you can download DOE's working definition for which those disadvantaged communities are. And then the CGES tool, which is still in beta form, which is the White House definition, is also there. And we have a comparison of these two as well. So you can see like the different approaches that groups are taking. It's not an easy thing to figure out what we mean by disadvantage. And so it's crucial to understand why different choices were made. So DOE's is a cumulative disadvantage and looks at very particular indices that are specifically energy related. Whereas CGES, looking at a broader whole of government approach, has not taken a cumulative approach yet. And because they're requesting feedback, if this is something you think is important, I encourage everybody to kind of take a look and play with both definitions and look at, your own zip code and your own understanding of that place. I'll also mention that even though there's a very strong definition for these place-based ones, we also have a second way of defining them. So both are valid. The second way is really a common characteristic. So you'll notice, for example, all tribal nations are classified under disadvantage just because of the prior treatment of these groups. Similarly for territories. And so the other way of classifying disadvantage is a common characteristic.
Awesome. So let's see. There's a lot of chat happening in the chat. I don't quickly see a lot of questions. Let's see. So people are going back and forth with giving the links for the screening tool, mentioning that there are 93 tracks in the draft list for Alaska. I know there has been some discussion among Alaskans who have looked at that map about whether or not things look accurate to them. So you mentioned that there is a comment period going on, and there is the ability, especially for people who are experts in their area, to weigh in.
Yes. And this can be in many forms. Like you can talk about the usability of the tool. You can talk about the data itself, the indicators chosen, the methodology. So they're open to any ideas. And I think given that you might be an expert in your particular location, that's really what they're seeking.
Awesome. And Steve, did you have a question?
Well, yes, it may not be easy to answer, but could you expand a little bit on the difference, if it's possible to generalize on the difference between the DOE tool and listing of disadvantaged communities versus the whole of government listing? And I posted in the chat, I found 93 census tracts on the list in Alaska. I believe that was from the whole of government approach with the 8 boxes. So how does the DOE tool shake out differently?
In some ways, they're actually quite similar. The methodology, I would say the two pieces in the method that are distinct. One is DOE's cumulative approach. So when we look at these indicators, DOE has 36, and they look at each different indicator. I think actually I can pull it up real quick so you guys can get a sense of the indicators. Let's see if I have it here. So these are the 36 that DOE looked at. And these indicators are different for the CGES tool. Many are similar. So I think we have quite an overlap on, for example, the environmental hazards. A lot of these come from EJ Screen. But as an example of a difference, DOE looked at fossil dependence, including fossil energy jobs ratio, which isn't currently in the CGES tool. So there's a difference in both the indicators chosen and then the methodology. The cumulative approach looks at all of these and kind of adds up the disadvantage to get a cumulative disadvantage score, whereas the CGES tool looks at 2 socioeconomic plus some other climate variables, and then looks at whether it gets triggered to be categorized as a disadvantaged community. And so these two methods are somewhat different, but when you look at the outcomes and look at how they overlay, there's almost an 80% overlap, and that's also driven by a lot of them being not DACs. But in certain locations, like what you might care about is whether it gets counted and not. And we particularly advocated the cumulative, so that's one of our recommendations, because it really does identify very specific locations, but this has to work for other agencies as well.
Thank you for that response. I see a couple more questions in the chat, but I am going to take MC privilege and ask a question. I just read an article about community. I believe it was specific to rural communities, but there was quite an overlay with tribal regions and other sort of metrics that would fall under disadvantage, about not having the capacity to apply for grants and opportunities. So, if we have these metrics that will help when weighting the applications that come in, is there some sort of a process to help communities without the capacity to apply in the first place?
Yeah, so a large part of what J40 is really looking at is helping how DOE designs its programs so that more people can access available resources. So right now with the bipartisan infrastructure law, there's a lot of resources, but capacity is a problem, especially for smaller groups or tribal groups that are resource limited. As an example, just again with the financing, if a program designs something requiring a cost share, maybe a 50% cost share, that might limit a lot of people. And so what we're looking at is how to reduce those barriers so that we can access and have a larger pool of applicants. Some ways that programs have looked at this is through technical assistance. There have been programs that look at go, no-go criteria, or looking at how to ensure that the applicant pool is broad enough, how to advertise these, and how to make sure that if a group needs technical assistance, they can and have access to that. And so this is really redesigning how things have been done in the past. And so it is somewhat of a slow effort, but I see that changes are happening in terms of certain programs really taking the lead. Like one that I like to highlight is the energy storage for social equity group. They take the equity piece into high consideration and really try to do a lot of outreach. And that's something else we work in, is how should we do outreach to ensure that our applicant pool is much more diverse?
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. So Mark Masteller asks, does the J40 program point people to resources they can apply for to address inequity and or climate justice? For example, if a Native community wanted to look for additional resources to build zero energy homes so they are affordable for owners.
Yeah, so currently the J40 piece is more of this big framework that I described. We do have resources on the website, but they typically focus on the program. I will say that Bill, what we're trying to do is put in a lot of the J40 framework into the bipartisan infrastructure law and implementation, particularly the implementation. And so under Bill, that's the attempt, is to try to ensure that communities can access. And so there's a lot of efforts in a variety of ways, but having, for example, a single point where people can go and look, having easier interfaces for websites so that you can find, having a person you can call to ask a specific question. All of these are attempts at changing how we deliver services to the community. And J40 is instrumental in informing how we can do that.
Thank you very much. There are other great questions in the chat. I am sorry that I didn't get to all of them and took my own prerogative to ask my question. So Anjali, if you have time to stick around and maybe put a couple quick answers in, that would be wonderful. I really appreciate it. And I really, really appreciate you being here and giving us this wonderful keynote and letting us know what's happening in the DOE and with these programs that are so important to Alaska. So everybody, please join me in thanking Anjali. And now this brings us to today's first session. So for the next 80 minutes, we're going to hear from leaders of our local utilities. This session is a little different from our other sessions. There will not be slide presentations. It's more of a picture of fireside chat without the fireside. So we're really excited to have this discussion and see where it leads. We have utility leaders and representatives from major Railbelt utilities in Alaska, as well as other utilities in Alaska, and also from a leading innovative utility from outside. As a reminder, during this session, questions can be submitted via the chat box. They'll be addressed during the discussion if there is time. Otherwise, hopefully people will get back into the chat and answer some of those questions, or there can be discussion within the chat. So please join me in welcoming the moderator for the panel, who will be introducing our participants briefly, and they'll have a spot to introduce themselves as well. So research professor of energy economics and policy for the Alaska Center for Energy and Power, Steve Colt, is a hero of mine. He has been very much a mentor and a very gracious one. He is extremely good at cheerleading and inspiring confidence in new and not so new researchers, and moving them forward on their path, and encouraging leadership and good participation in this world. So I really appreciate Steve being part of our beneficial and equitable electrification group, and please join me in welcoming him as the moderator for session 3, the first session for today.
Thank you, Michelle. What an opportunity we have for the next hour plus. Just a tremendous lineup of the people who make it happen. So before I forget, I want to just start out by saluting all of our panelists for the tremendous day in, day out work they do to keep the electric grid in their respective places up and running. It is the world's largest machine, and it's just amazing when you stop and think about it, which we rarely have time to do, except I suppose when it's off. Then it's like Joni Mitchell's, you don't know what you got till it's gone. So all of you can take a bow or feel good as we go into this discussion. And what I'd like to do is begin by asking, I'm a big fan of self-introductions, so I'm going to go down the list. I think you'll all end up staying on the screen, and ask you to introduce yourself, and if you wish, take an additional few seconds to highlight something that you think is particularly interesting or just salient about electrification, beneficial or not, as it affects your utility. So let's start. I guess this may end up being alphabetical. Let's start with Matt Burgin from Kotzebue Electric Association.
Good morning, everyone. Yeah, my name is Matt Burgin. I'm an engineer for Kotzebue Electric Association. I kind of wear many hats here. We're a pretty small, slim operation. And primarily, I'm involved with the generation side of the equation. But you got to kind of learn everything. So I get involved with the distribution side as well. And yeah, by training, I'm a mechanical engineer, but hanging around here for 25 years, I've learned quite a bit of electrical. My mentor in the electrical field was Craig Thompson, a longtime engineer, recently deceased from Anchorage, who taught me very well. And I learned a lot from him in the 20 years I spent with him here in Kotzebue. And yeah, we're a small diesel electric utility with wind and now solar and battery storage. And ultimately, we're trying to just get away from burning diesel fuel as much as possible due to the obvious health and environmental issues, but also the annual unknown cost of diesel, which this year looks like it's twice as much as it was last year. So that's a little bit about me.
Thank you, Matt. I think the next person on the list would be Josh Kraft. Good morning.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Josh Kraft. I'm the Grid Modernization Manager for Matanuska Electric Association. I got my start in the renewable sector and the energy sector back in the mid-2000s by helping develop the first commercial wind farm on the Railbelt up in Delta Junction. I spent 8 years working for Alaska Energy Authority, where I ended up running the state's wind program and emerging technology fund. And I've been with Matanuska Electric for the last 3 years, running the grid modernization program. I guess where I see beneficial electrification is it's all in its name. There's benefits for the member, there's benefits for the membership, and or benefits for the general public, where we can convert energy use to electricity. The individual member from an EV perspective, say, will save money There's additional energy sales for the utility, which means the membership as a whole spreads the fixed costs across a greater energy sales. And from a public perspective, there's environmental and economic benefits as well. And, you know, in some cases, even the member might be looking from an environmental perspective, especially from a solar PV installation. So I think I'll stop there for just a real short introduction, and before we go too far into any details.
Thanks, Josh. Great preview of what I think we'll be talking about more. Next person to welcome is JD Draves, I believe from Homer Electric.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. Let me introduce myself. I'm JD Draves. I'm the manager of regulatory affairs and rate design here at Homer Electric. I've been doing this position for 11 years. Prior to that, I spent a number of years in the investment business, in the energy and utility sector. Here at Homer Electric, when it comes to electrical benefits of electrification, we've got a couple of avenues we're starting to move down. One is the EV path, and to that effect, this past Saturday we had the ribbon cutting for the Tesla supercharger here down in Soldotna. It was well attended. We're good to see that. Also here in Homer itself, at the very end of the road, last fall we had one of the first, I guess might be the better way to describe, DC fast chargers put in the state with the Volkswagen money. So we're moving in that area. And I will say that in the area of heat pumps, the board at HEA is getting active in this area. And I would just tell people to stay tuned. And I think there'll be something coming up very soon in that area. Thank you.
Thank you, JD. Next person, I think, in the alphabetical lineup is Daniel Heckman from Golden Valley Electric.
Good morning, everyone, and good morning, Steve. Good to see you again, as always, sir. My name is Daniel Heckman. I'm the regulatory manager for Golden Valley Electric Association up in Fairbanks. I have been in this position now, just recently moved into the position, but I've been in regulatory affairs now for 9 years total between Golden Valley and with Dorian Utilities, the investor-owned utility also in Fairbanks. But thinking from a Golden Valley perspective here, our thought process is pretty much consistent with what Josh and JD have really kind of opened the discussion on, is that, we see beneficial electrification as something that can help, depending on, again, a technology, lower costs, reduce carbon emissions, increase reliability, or expand capability by having electrical devices on the system. So we're also kind of implementing the EV rate that was recently approved by the RCA, and I'll take this as an opportunity to plug in an event that Golden Valley is having, I believe, in August, kind of like an EV drive-in event that's going to be up at our campus. We have a couple of EV chargers on our campus as well. So that's something that we're looking forward to. And that's kind of where we're at right now, but looking forward to having a more thorough discussion.
Thank you, Daniel. Great stuff to hopefully elaborate on. Next up to say good morning, get on the screen, is Alec Mesdag from Southeast Alaska.
Yeah, hi, I'm Alec Mesdag. I'm the Director of Energy Services and Metering at Alaska Electric Light and Power. We are an investor-owned utility serving Juneau. And I really appreciated the keynote this morning because one of the things that I'm most focused on as we see more and more folks looking to convert to electric vehicles or get rid of oil and move to heat pumps in Juneau is what will the eventual need for new infrastructure mean for the many, many people in Juneau who live in apartments, residential apartments with electric resistance heat, where they don't have the option to convert their heating source to a new source, or even upgrade their thermostat to something better than a single knob. So that's one of the things I'm most interested in, and trying to figure out how do we make sure that beneficial electrification benefits people of all means.
Great. Welcome, Alec. Next up, someone I've known for a very long time and greatly admire all the work he's done to on many fronts to move Alaska towards more sustainability. Sean Scaling.
Hey, Steve. Thanks. Feelings mutual. So yeah, Sean Scaling here with Chugach Electric. I'm the manager of business and sustainable program development, and Chugach serves Anchorage area and Northern Kenai Peninsula and some other surrounding areas. I've been with Chugach for about 5 years, and prior to that was at Alaska Energy Authority as deputy director, and then prior to that ran Green Star for about 10 years. So as far as your question, Steve, kind of what's special about beneficial electrification is the way I take it. I think the approach I take and Chugach takes is it's all about efficient utilization. There's a lot of electric infrastructure to generate and deliver electricity to the end customer. How can we best utilize that to benefit all? And the beautiful thing about beneficial electrification is it usually benefits everybody involved. Lower cost to the members for whatever piece of equipment they're moving to electric, lower cost for everybody, regardless of if they do that, because we're using the system better. And I'm sure we're going to dive way into it, so I'll leave it at that for now. Thanks.
Thank you, Sean. Great to see you. Last and definitely not least, is Graham Turk from Green Mountain Power. And Graham has been so gracious with all of us in Alaska. He has appeared numerous times at these workshops to share experiences from completely different place. And we really appreciate it, Graham. So I guess I'll say welcome back.
Thank you, Steve. And yeah, I feel like Alaska's eastern cousin in some ways in Vermont. So it's great to be here and excited to have this discussion. I think for us, it's a lot of the same themes. We've been deploying battery storage, electric vehicle, managed charging, heat pumps and heat pump management for a while now. And for me, electrification, you see there's an article I think yesterday in the New York Times talking about all these pressures that are raising electric rates, whether it be weatherization or fuel prices. And to me, electrification is the one thing going in the opposite direction. And it wasn't covered in the article. And I read it really bitter. And I was like, but they didn't talk about EVs and heat pumps and all these awesome things. So I see it as just the key to keeping costs manageable, to kind of achieving that virtuous cycle of the more you electrify, the lower the costs, and taking us to that promised land of a much reduced emissions economy through devices that we've proven out. We know they work, and I think especially if we can show they work in our climates, there's no excuse for the rest of the country.
Great, thank you, Graham. And now we're all on the big screen together. I would like to encourage everyone on the screen to please feel free, or even more than that, jump in and follow up if you want. Ask each other for follow-ups, or I'll try to make some pauses and actually ask if anyone has a question for someone else in particular, and we'll try to monitor the chat. I invite Michelle or others to help me monitor the chat and maybe get your hand up or somehow get the attention if we have questions from the audience. I don't want to just wait till the end. But I will now get things going from my long list of questions. I'm not going to run out no matter what happens. We've had a great preview of sort of what's good, what the upside is of beneficial electrification. And that was kind of my first general questions, and what makes it beneficial in particular for your utility. But I think we've already had a good preview of that answer. So in the spirit of the dismal scientists, that's what us economists are, right? I'd like to throw out the question of, okay, this sort of sounds in many ways too good to be true. So what factors do we need to be alert to in order to avoid having there be some downfalls or some disadvantages? I've heard a few, but I'd like to just throw it open to you guys. And if you want, you can also elaborate on what the upsides are for your specific utility.
Steve, do you just want us to jump in?
Yeah, just jump in. We'll see. I think that'll work.
Okay, so I guess to reframe the question, what are the advantages and disadvantages to some of the different beneficial electrification? Obviously, the advantages to the utility itself is increased energy sales. And when we have increased energy sales, that means that we have a stabilization of costs, at least, because we are spreading the fixed costs across greater energy sales. And so that's the primary benefit to the utility as we see it. Advantages to the individual members, I think was already touched on. A lot of these technologies can be cheaper than the alternatives, whether it's electric vehicles or heat pumps. But there can be a disadvantage, especially with maybe like electric vehicles per se. If you have every EV member coming home at 6 p.m. and plugging into a 10 kilowatt level 2 charger, we could see a significant increase in our peak load. And that load growth is great. It could be a very good thing, unless we see a corresponding huge increase in peak load that would require like new generation or something to that extent. So what we're really looking at, I know several of us have studies underway, or Graham is probably way ahead of us, but we're trying to figure out how do we mitigate that peak load increase. Some of my projections I've run could be, 160% increase in our peak load if we do nothing. But if we do some combination of maybe a discount rate and some demand side management, that increase could be as low as like 20%. So that's a huge disparity in peak load increase, and could definitely be beneficial to us to mitigate early and often.
Anyone else? Sean, jump in, Sean.
Yeah, I was just going to say, right along the lines of what Josh was talking about, all of us utilities have this daily load profile. You start low early in the morning or overnight. You have a morning peak. Something happens during the day. It stays high, usually dips down a little bit, evening peak, and then comes down. To the extent we can levelize that, all our equipment is running much more efficiently, much more consistently. So it's all about, not only raising that bar and using the whole system better, but really flattening the bar. And so we want to avoid those peaks. With EV rates, for example, so everybody doesn't plug in at 6 p.m. or something, that'll be important. And then one thing that we've looked at recently is heat pumps. And one nice thing about heat pumps is they do become less efficient when it gets really cold, and we peak when it gets really cold. And so they'll generally be switching back to natural gas or oil at that peak time. So it's actually a kind of a nice match in theory if people actually behave that way.
I'll add that a lot of the issues related to what beneficial electrification, whether electrification is beneficial, I think depends a lot on the system that you're connecting that technology to. So in Juneau, where we have, we're 100% hydropower 99.7% of the time, not all energy sales affect the system equally. For us to, deal with the load issue associated with electric vehicles is a bit simpler, or quite a bit simpler, than for us to handle a large scale shift from oil to electric heat, whether that's heat pumps or resistance heat, because of the seasonality of that use, and a resource that tends to sit frozen up high when people are needing the heat the most. So it really, we see certainly that, like where Josh talked about how the increased energy sales provides a benefit. For us, it really depends on what we're selling, what end use we're selling that energy for. If it's just for electric heat, then the likely need for increased infrastructure in our system is still going to be a net increase in the cost of electricity.
Great perspective. Graham, I can't resist asking you if
Sure.
if you might be a little farther along than some of us. Did you have any unpleasant surprises that you might want to relate in your journey so far?
Yeah, we've learned a lot by trial and error. I think we've, on the good side, we know that EV charging is an extremely flexible load. We have a rate where customers effectively pay an off-peak rate at all hours except for when we actively curtail charging, and they pay a very high price during those hours. But in the 3 years we've had that rate, maybe there've been 7 opt-outs across 1,500 customers and in 3 events per month. So it is extremely rare that customers need to do that. And it's kind of helped convince us that EVs are so flexible that I don't foresee a world where we're not able to shift things around overnight, and kind of build a flat load profile, or even one that matches renewable generation, using kind of a subset of customers that we're triggering them to charge and discharge in a vehicle to grid world when they can send energy back at times that we need it most. I think on the heat pump front, it is, as you said, a little more challenging. There isn't a great product yet for managing heat pump loads. We use one called Sensibo that's a kind of a retrofit thermostat, but you don't get load information back, and you're changing the temperature set point, but that could impact occupant comfort. People might override it. And so I think we've tested out some products in the integrated control space, a single thermostat that could control both a heat pump system and a backup fossil fuel system. And while there's definitely some hesitance from some folks around, oh, well, if you're just kicking over to a backup propane boiler, are you really helping? And the answer is still absolutely, because all the rest of the hours of the year when you're running off electric, if it means you can reduce your peak costs by kicking over to 2 or 3 hours and run on fossil fuel for that time, I think it's well worth that trade-off.
Great, good stuff. Anyone else want to weigh in on this question before we move on? Great, let's move on. And we have a great question in the chat, which does relate to something that was also on my list. It relates to the equity aspect. And Alec has already alluded, Alec already brought this up, that one of the downsides, seems to me, of beneficial electrification is that it could leave certain groups behind or shift burdens towards groups or subsets of our customers that already have burdens. So let me just read the question from Anjali directly, use her words. It's in the chat, but I'm going to read it. Regarding equity, are any of your utilities going through a process to understand the barriers and disparities in services due to demographic or other characteristics? Are you making these, if so, are you making these publicly available, or are there any other equity programs at your utility to understand service provision, access, and participation? That is a very important question and a tough one, but who wants to take it on? Matt, great.
Well, I'll take a stab at it. Yeah, I mentioned in my intro there, diesel fuel. So as a utility, we're trying to get away from diesel fuel as a power generation source, but diesel fuel also heats all our homes and businesses in the community. And as a utility, we have access to relatively inexpensive diesel fuel, but diesel fuel, which is heating fuel or stove oil for homeowners, is at a far higher price per gallon. And I can tell you from my perspective as a resident, my heating cost per year is far higher than my electrical cost. We have an electrical program in rural Alaska called PCE that really helps equalize the cost of electricity in rural Alaska to the Railbelt. But heating fuel is still outrageous. We're paying $6 a gallon out here, and it's supposed to go up to $9 a gallon this summer for a gallon of diesel fuel for heating. So a small home here, they're paying in terms of their utility or their maintenance costs for their home, 3/4 of their costs are heating fuel. The other quarter is for electric. So whatever we can do to help reduce that heating cost for them. And for us, it's with excess renewables as what we're looking at. We've got one beneficial electrification customer right now, the hospital. But as we install more renewables, wind and solar, we're trying to get down into the individual homes where we're adding some sort of electric heating device, resistive heating device that we control and help reduce that use of stove oil in the homes to really help our members get out of essentially energy poverty. A lot of our members are in energy poverty here in Kotzebue and in rural Alaska.
Thanks, Matt. That's a great perspective. It's always hard for me, even after 30 years, to remember, get so focused on electricity, and meanwhile the heating bill is going up and up and up for everybody. Any others on this one? Go, Daniel. Thanks.
No, thank you for that question. And that's a tough question. And it's a tough question as you're asking that of electric cooperatives that, the thing that I tell, both internal and external stakeholders here is that our tariff, governs a relationship between our utility and the member without any true regard for, what your, financial position may be and everything. We do have, programs in our tariff that if you're having issues with your bill, there are programs in our tariff that can address that. But your question is actually perfectly timed, because on something else that we're working on, this exact question was raised, and then there was that conflict, between what we want to do in order to address those populations within our service territory who are struggling, but recognizing that, we are obligated to treat membership alike, across the board. And so I wish I could give you the answer is yes. The answer sadly is for us right now is no, but it's something that I think is, at least for Golden Valley, in the back of our minds, that, how can we, make it so that it's not maybe expressly calling that situation out, but maybe putting in a program or something that is kind of broadly applied, but promotes access for everyone, especially those who are having financial difficulties. So I think if we kind of look at it from that lens, I think you'll get the diversity and equity question that you're asking.
Oh, just
Go
one.
ahead, JD.
Yeah, I would say one follow up to Daniel. In HEA, I generally agree with Daniel. Daniel's pretty much got it, as well as Matt. Another aspect, I think, in our service territory too, is also the access to the technology to be able to do some of these things. I know, for example, with heat pumps, great technology and everything, but if you're going to have to bring a contractor down from Anchorage and pay extra money, especially the areas we think where the heat pumps could actually be most beneficial to our membership. Unfortunately, it's an area that does not have access to natural gas. They're all on propane or home heating oil. This would be a benefit to them, but it's very much a challenge when you're economically living paycheck to paycheck to save up that money to make that kind of an investment. And then to find out, well, not only is the unit expensive, but I'm going to have to pay extra to bring it down and have the expertise. And if the unit has an issue, do I have to get a repairman to come down from Anchorage again to adjust my unit? So access to the technology, just one more thing to add.
One, to jump on that a little bit, I mentioned the issue that we're concerned about here in Juneau of folks who live in multifamily housing with electric resistance heat and without the ability to make changes to their heating system on their own. We have done some study, recently completed some survey work to kind of identify how landlords and tenants both view the cost issues surrounding that. So what sorts of education needs and financial incentives does a landlord need to add a heat pump in an apartment that is heated with electric resistance heat? And then what are the sensitivities to price changes for the tenant? And to try to kind of figure out exactly what are the levers that could be used to encourage heat pump adoption in that situation. Because for us, looking at desire by the community to shift, in a very large way away from heating oil as a heating source, and move that load to the electric system. Clearly, electric resistance heat that is currently in use and providing probably about 15% of the total space heating requirements in Juneau, that's a great target for making more energy available for oil to electric conversions without increasing our need for new investment in the electric system. So if we have to put some cost to encouraging those types of switches, then that clearly represents our lowest cost resource. And maybe we can demonstrate that the cost shifting that occurs in that situation is secondary to the value gained by all customers for us to purchase the lowest cost resource and reducing the amount of electric resistance heat in the system.
I can jump in with just, if we have a moment, Steve, with just one quick little anecdote here too. I think we all strive to keep rates low because we hear from our members that's really, really important. So that's kind of just a fundamental. The little tidbit I wanted to add is most of us can't afford electric vehicles yet. They're still pretty expensive. They're still pretty luxury. That's improving, but there's not a ton of them available yet. But to that extent, all the EV drivers out there who can afford it are helping in small ways at this point, but lower everybody's costs just through that increased sales. And then one other little piece of that is we are really interested because there's a chicken and egg thing. If you live in a single family home and you can, plug in your garage, great. If you live in an apartment, where are you going to plug in if you have an EV? So we're looking at where in Anchorage do we have denser housing and where can we put DC fast chargers that everybody could benefit. So at least the, I'm not sure if it's the chicken or the egg, but at least the first one is there so that when the opportunity comes for maybe, lesser expensive EVs or used EVs, that there's an opportunity for everybody to participate.
And Steve, if we have another moment, I could jump in for a second. So I think, all of us have touched on it, at least in part, that we recognize a lot of these beneficial electrification technologies have some fairly significant upfront capital costs. I think several of us have programs in place where, for instance, chugach, and now we're kicking off our level 2 pilot program where we're trying to get data collection, but also part of that is providing a level 2 charger to the member. Another example would be our net metering programs where the state only requires us to go up to a certain amount of our energy sales in net metering. But a lot of us have recognized that those capital costs led towards early investment by, probably more affluent folks. And we're trying to make sure that those programs stay accessible and stay open. So many of us have raised our maximums on that. And I know MEA, we are exploring innovative rate designs to make sure that those programs stay available in the long term so that as prices continue to come down and folks have more access to net metering or to electric vehicles, all of those programs remain open and available to people as the capital cost issue can be addressed.
Fantastic. We have some great questions coming into the chat, and I'm going to try to not deliberately ignore any, but try to keep a little bit of a flow going here. And one that just came in, which is a direct follow-up to the problem of financing the equipment, which, by the way, I can't resist one little vignette from my own learning is that in many applications, I was looking at data from Europe, the equipment cost levelized, if you will, or however you want to do it, actually swamps the fuel cost for heating in some applications. Now that's probably in warmer climates, but it was still a really good wake-up call to me to remember that you might see fuel savings as far as the eye can see, but if you can't get over the hump of the equipment investment, it still may not pay. So along those lines, you have a great question. I'm just going to read it again. Could anyone speak to explorations of on-bill financing to extend the access to savings to all, whether you're renters or fixed income, renters in multifamily buildings or fixed income customers?
Well, I know that onboard financing has been discussed in the past. I know the primary issue is the administration of administering that program is very expensive. And so I think that is the major hurdle, at least at Matanuska Electric, is just the administration of a program of on-bill financing can be quite burdensome. And we're trying to figure out how to do that without adding cost to the general membership. And that's the key issue, I think, that's been found in the past.
I think one other thing so when we looked at it at AEL&P recently, we looked at it with the intent that we would partner with a financial institution and essentially, they'd send us account number and a number, or location code and a number, right? And we can add that to a bill and then basically be the payment processor, right? We collect the payment, we send it off to a financial institution, and they manage the loan. One of the issues that we ran into, though, is with the Alaska law that enables on-bill financing, there are some weird requirements related to the transfer of debt and a warranty that the utility must offer to whomever is trying to finance an energy efficiency technology or renewable energy technology with on-bill financing. And I think that actually presents probably, from our perspective, even a bigger issue than finding somebody who will service the loans. So I think we found a way maybe to make it fairly simple for us to administer. And we had some things in place already with our accounting system that made it relatively easy for us to integrate. It was more that there were some limitations in what was required, what the utilities are required to offer to the customer that makes it kind of untenable at this point.
And I think that's why we were looking at administering it ourselves, but it made it not really that cost effective.
And I can just say from Golden Valley's perspective, this is a topic that we've actually our board tasked our member advisory committee to basically come up with a recommendation for an on-bill financing program at Golden Valley. The board, heard their recommendations, and now staff is basically working with the committee on finalizing something. But I think as we've been having these discussions to the points that both Josh and Alec are raising, those are some of the things that we're kind of trying to iron out amongst ourselves. I think the one thing that has been an absolute, kind of a topic of discussion is that under the bill that I think Alec was referring to, say if a member installs a device through the on-bill financing program, and then they were given basically some sort of line item charge on their bill to pay back the cost of basically putting that on, under the bill, I believe you have the potential to disconnect that member from that because they failed to make a payment on that specific charge. So kind of ironing that out has been kind of something that we've been struggling with, but and we're also about to go through a whole software conversion here at Golden Valley that may actually make this more possible. But again, I think it's something that we hear that membership wants. I think it's something that we're definitely looking at implementing here, but all these other things that Josh and Alec referred to, those issues keep on percolating.
Yeah.
Good, Matt. I'm going to put you on the spot. So please.
I was just going to say, so yeah, I think Copsview is still a USDA borrower, and I think USDA has a program like that. I think it was called Red Leg or something like that. So it seems great, but yeah, like Josh said, when you get into the details and minutia of how to actually do it, and the what ifs of what if people don't pay, warranty stuff, it just becomes pretty complicated. So I think there's funds out there to do it, but the process to do it gets complicated and probably expensive too.
Yeah, the devil is in the details. I remember writing papers about this in 1982 when I was a graduate student, and I thought, well, they'll get this figured out, but it's terribly difficult. I'd like to echo that from the perspective of the academic world. Graham, it's time to put you on the spot. You've been having a great exchange of information in the chat, which it'll be captured for those who want to read it. But I'm going to ask you to be the leadoff hitter to a question, which I hope I can phrase somewhat coherently. We've heard already that electrification could be really bad if it just raises your peak. And Josh has already pointed out that there could be a wide range of the impacts on the peak or on the distribution system, depending on how you manage it. So maybe this is a tough thing to summarize, because could you try to give us your greatest hits about what works well and what has not worked so well, and 3, what is coming down the pike that is going to work better?
Yeah, so in peak management, we have a bunch of different tools, everything from your old school demand response program where we call up a ski resort and tell them to not make snow for the next 4 hours, to an automatic signal that basically dispatches power walls. We have a fleet of about 19 megawatts of power walls in customers' homes that decides in real time whether to dispatch or not. So whole range of communication, sophistication. I think what's worked well is having just to start having the ability to talk to devices at all. I think that while time of use rates are definitely a piece of the puzzle, the direct management will allow us to adapt more as our peaks flatten out, and we need to start dispatching at different times than we might have 5 years ago. A tariff with a fixed time of use on peak period is a little more rigid, so it doesn't give you the flexibility to manage loads as well as those loads evolve. I think where we've struggled sometimes is we have so much flexible load now relative to our own peak that you start to see cases where we'll shift the peak to a different hour. So we might have all of our resources gunning at hour ending 19 on a Thursday, and it turns out that we knocked that down so much it promoted Tuesday to be the high water mark for that month. And so going forward, a lot of our efforts going to be put towards how do we're going to need to invest in software to find a tool that does this, but that aids our power supply team in deciding when to dispatch and how across this diversity of resources. And so it's in the works, but we're not there yet. And I think it's been, we kind of knew we'd come to this point eventually as our peaks flattened out, and we're definitely arriving there.
Steve, can I add to putting Graham on the spot?
Yes, now everyone gets to jump in and put Graham on the spot, and you can put each other on the spot about what you're doing also, please.
Well, Graham brought up a great point about the communications protocols. And I know whenever we start talking about controlling devices or demand side management, the first thing we got to figure out is, well, how do we actually talk to those devices? And communications up here, I think, as everybody knows, can be spotty. And, we've looked at using our AMI system. We've looked at, do you just install cell phones? Do you use Wi-Fi? There's mesh networks. There's all of these things out there, but really a lot of it is very expensive. And so I guess my question to Graham is, what communications protocols are you using, and what are you finding is the easiest to install and make that work?
Yeah, so it does depend. Like we have certain systems are larger scale batteries that are controlled directly from our control center with SCADA. Then we've got our Powerwall fleet, which is effectively through Tesla's cloud. They use cellular and the customer's Wi-Fi as kind of a backup if it's not a strong cellular connection. We've haven't really done much in sort of the like IEEE open standards, just because a lot of the devices we integrate with, they are using proprietary APIs rather than going open source. And so I know there's a lot of attention and effort around things like OpenADR and IEEE protocols. And not to say we wouldn't adopt them if device manufacturers embrace them, but I don't think we want to wait for that to happen to start getting our practice managing these loads and offering devices to customers at a discount, like our Powerwall program or our Bring Your Own Device battery program. We don't want to have standards be a barrier to being able to offer those, since we know customers want backup, and the storage lease program has been a good way to deliver that.
Anybody else want to share their stories or echo or adjust that concern about communications? It sounds like, to me, it sounds like we need to, it goes right in there with the cold weather as one of the challenges that makes Alaska potentially different or more challenging than some other places.
One thing I might add to that part of the conversation.
Go ahead, Alec.
So there is a, we definitely see communication as a big problem when it comes to when you're, starting to greatly increase the number of devices that are out there. And, but then also I think a lot of the, going back to the idea that how you respond is really specific to the system that you're operating in, where I think a lot of the discussion around demand response is about managing peak loads. For ALP, we are managing interruptible loads for annual energy, right? So we have big swings in the amount of energy that's available because of changes in precipitation from year to year. So our large interruptible customers are in order to preserve water for our firm customers. And we're not, we are very, very rarely using our demand response for managing peak loads. There are some occasions where we have one program, we have a hot water load control program where we have about 2,000 to 2,500 resistance hot water tanks that are on a load control switch that delays it delays the restoration of power following an outage. And so that's a way for us to just pick up the system faster, because we have a couple feeders now where, if it's below 40 degrees, we might actually have to bring on an EMD for frequency support when we bring that on, just because the hydro doesn't respond quite fast enough. And, so there's these really very, very limited situations where we're actually using that for peak load issues. It's almost exclusively for managing energy.
Great point, Alec. Josh, were you wanting to say something more?
Oh, I just was going to, piggybacking on some of what Graham had said earlier, is our level 2 pilot program. We're going to be experimenting a little bit with demand side management, but not having a real firm communications protocol. We're actually going to be trying to use the smart level 2 chargers and then on the cloud management services to kind of experiment with it a little bit to get more of a member perspective on, did they even notice that we were throttling the EV charging or moving the EV charging, just to get an idea of what was their experience with the demand side management, because we don't want that experience to be a bad thing. We want the demand side management to be welcomed as part of adopting the electric vehicles in our service territory.
Great. I'm having a little bit of a struggle trying to figure out the next best question to ask, but let's do it this way. Actually, I think I've got two ideas. So, okay, the first one is, we seem to, at least I hear a lot about V2G, vehicle to grid, and now the Department of Energy is pushing out memorandums of understanding to look at V2X, vehicle to everything. So let me see if I can just throw this out there. Are we ready to embrace the electric vehicle as a dispatchable or quasi-dispatchable resource, or is it still too early to be really going into this V2X world? And I'll just open it up.
It seems this is Sean here. It seems in theory like it's a great idea. If you have all this extra storage out there, like Graham was saying, rather than the power wall, now you have a bunch of powered vehicles. But I guess the two things I'm seeing are, one is how expensive is it to set up the communication and for the member to set up their end of it? And then the other is, do the members want that? I guess I've heard quite a few people talking about, will it affect the life of the vehicle and what's the value of that? And can the utility actually offer enough value for that service? So definitely some questions out there, but in a pure sense, it seems really appealing. But the hurdles seem high.
I guess from my perspective, on the Railbelt, especially for Matanuska Electric, the marginal cost of our different power sources is basically the same across the day. There's not a whole lot of reason for us to pull power from the vehicles at this point. So it may be a little early in the discussion to talk about implementation, but it's definitely something to keep our eyes on as the technologies improve and the communication protocols are addressed. Because that's, again, my primary concern is, how do we communicate with the devices in the most effective manner to actually make that work? And I just don't know that we have that solved at this point. And again, when we're talking about the peak management, we're not even concerned with that maybe in this year or even in 5 years, but in 10 years, maybe that peak management really is the concern that we're talking about. So we're, I think, well ahead right now of the EV industry and the EV adoption in Alaska, but we are trying to plan for the penetration levels that I think we see coming in 5 and 10 years. So I think we're well ahead of the game at this point, but that doesn't mean that it won't sneak up on us if we don't pay attention.
Thanks. Hey, Matt Burgin, can I put you on the spot? Because Josh just pointed out that his marginal or his incremental generation costs do not vary too much, but clearly in Kotzebue, your incremental generation costs go from $9 diesel intermittently down to zero when the wind is blowing. So do you have anything that you might want to add to whether you're looking at the vehicle as some way of smoothing the intermittent renewables problem?
Yeah, I would say it's not, it could be vehicle to grid, but it's more along the line of distributed energy storage is how we kind of are looking at it. I'm curious to learn more about how the power walls are working in Vermont. And essentially, it's either us as a utility are going to build a huge battery in one location to serve the whole community, or is it more cost effective, or are there better opportunities if we have, say, 500 batteries, smaller batteries distributed around the community at homes and businesses that we can control? So it's sort of both have the advantage of having storage for when we do have a lot of wind, we can charge up all these storage devices or for use at a later time to reduce our peak or to continue to reduce our diesel fuel burn. So I think it's really a question of just storage in general. The more storage I think we have, the better we're going to be in the long run in terms of reducing our diesel usage. We're looking at we're installing a new AMI in the coming year here. That's an RF wireless system. The one we have now works, but it's a power line carrier based. So with the RF, we're looking forward to having a lot better communications on our system as far as both for metering, but also for controlling remote devices potentially. And yeah, we sort of see distributed storage as really something that could help both our members, but us in general in terms of increasing the amount of storage we have on our system for renewables.
Matt, I can't
Steve?
resist a quick follow-up, and that
Yep.
is thermal stoves, because thermal stoves
Yes.
could be part of the equation, and we haven't mentioned them, I don't think, at all in this workshop. So here's your chance to tell us exciting or interesting things about thermal stoves.
Well, there are some experts on the thermal stoves in the state that I'm still hoping to go visit now that the pandemic is over. And that's the Chugach Wind Group down in Southwest Alaska. They have been doing a tremendous job of essentially storing thermal energy in homes to help them reduce their stove oil consumption for homes, and it provides extra revenue for the utilities there. And that's all from wind power. So we're trying to follow in their footsteps and learn how they're doing it to do something similar. So essentially storing heat in bricks. These are essentially thermal bricks that you're heating up these bricks when you have excess renewables on the system, and that energy, it's in 10 to 15 kilowatt hours of energy, can be dissipated over hours or days as the customer needs it for their home. So the Steffi's units or the thermal stoves are a great device, but you get into a control situation, and that's where we're hoping our AMI will be able to remotely enable or disable those thermal stoves, but also provide the metering. We're looking at installing essentially 2 meters on the houses at this point, a meter for normal power, and then a second meter for interruptible power. The interruptible power is essentially for beneficial electrification. And we're not sure where EVs or heat pumps, which meter that's going to be on. At this point, it's looking like the normal meter, and resistive heat will be on the interruptible meter.
Great. Anyone? I could throw this one over to Graham. So do you want to add anything that we haven't talked about, any devices that you guys have discovered that we haven't mentioned already? Otherwise, we can sort of, well, actually, yeah. Did you want to add anything, Graham, really quick?
Yeah, so a handful of others. We've looked at heat pumps with integrated storage. There's a company from Nova Scotia called Stash working on that. On the vehicle to grid side, we have a charger at our office, and I think are very bullish on V2G. It's just the math where it's basically equivalent. If you have like a 60 kilowatt hour vehicle, like a Chevy Bolt, you basically have 4 Tesla Powerwalls worth of energy, and could have backup for up to 3 days, let's say. So I think that there's definitely going to be different ways that we're going to dispatch that. You don't have the reliability of batteries hanging on a wall. So there might be a slightly different compensation structure we have than a lease. Maybe we pay for performance, and it's based on when the car is actually plugged in. But I see it as huge potential to kind of transform the economics of EV ownership. And if all of a sudden your car can become your home backup, in addition to a source of revenue for selling energy back to the grid when we need it most, I think all of a sudden it makes it a pretty compelling proposition against internal combustion, even if the sticker price remains a little bit higher.
Steve, I have a couple of things I'd like to touch on real quick if you.
Oh yeah,
So to Graham's last point about selling the power to the grid, I will say there are no tariffs for that in the state of Alaska at this point, and I don't even think that ancillary services are covered anywhere. So that would be a brand new regulation, brand new tariff that would have to be introduced and figured out on the Railbelt. To Matt's earlier point about distributed energy storage, it's a great idea from a microgrid and a resiliency reliability perspective. When you're relying on it from a vehicle to grid, though, is that vehicle actually at the location that you can use it, particularly in Matanuska service territory, where we have 20,000 commuters leave every day and go to Anchorage for work. So if a significant portion of our EV membership is in Anchorage during the day, 5 days a week, how much can we count on that distributed energy storage as a true resource in our service territory becomes the question. Not that it can't be figured out, but just things that we need to consider moving forward.
Yeah, I'll jump on that as well. And this looks like it's getting into a question that Tim Leach asked about renewables and EVs and dispatch. And so it's a question of, is the load shed there or the load there? So dispatchers, when either wind or solar does or doesn't show up as expected, can they pull a lever and get all the energy they want? Not just demand for a few seconds or a few minutes, but really it's probably more like it's a 24-hour schedule ahead for gas, which is difficult, very difficult and expensive to change. And so do we have that amount of energy that maybe lasts for 4 hours or 16 hours or a day? So it gets really complicated, but we are looking at how can we use these other factors to bring in renewables, because the variability and the difficulty in predicting them definitely creates a big challenge for dispatchers, and then therefore expense.
Anybody else? Alec, do you have any perspectives from experience or aspirations in some of these distributed resources as storage?
Yeah, I think they're not in the immediate future for us, because we do already have we have Snettisham and Lake Dorothy and Annex Lake and the Salmon Creek Reservoir. So we have some big batteries and high alpine lakes, and our primary issue again is just that seasonal storage of energy to meet our very high loads through the wintertime. So it's actually right now is the time of year when we're kind of in that in-between state of our lakes are pretty low and we're waiting for inflows to come in and make sure that we don't get too low and need supplemental diesel generation. So yes, we're definitely a lot more focused on how do we manage the long-term energy storage.
Great. I'm going to pivot because we're starting to run down the clock, and I really want to get a little bit into the realm of rates and policy and regulation. Not sure we even tried to get some regulators into this workshop, but we know they're out there, and the fact that we're in a regulated environment is really important. So we had one question from Tim Leach that I'm trying to find so that I don't have to phrase the words. He's done it. And this is a big, broad one. What are the main policy barriers to beneficial electrification that need to be addressed to accelerate BE adoption?
I'll start off this discussion.
That's a tough question. So good luck.
So I think I'll put it through a narrower lens of, I think, what most of us utilities, recently saw through the EV rate adoption. That, if I, speaking from a regulatory, RCA point of view, the RCA is you either have to do a rulemaking change in order to allow for regulations to call for some of these technologies, which is a typical a 2-year process, which is a long process in itself, or absent that your frameworks for proposing some of these are very limited because the RCA is concerned first and foremost with rate impact to the membership and everything. And sometimes you have to get pretty creative when you're advocating for various things. I think with the EV rate adoption, the utilities show that we all worked together to adopt a methodology that was eventually adopted by the commission, that we were then able to put in tariff filings that were consistent with that methodology. But that was a long process. I think probably longer than all of us probably would have liked. But I think if we're talking from a more regulatory portion of it, it's that sometimes our regulations are just are very. They're not written to call for some of these technologies. And, sometimes going through a 2-year process to make that change is not, something that a lot of people have a lot of appetite for sometimes. So I think I can open up the discussion on that, but that to me is a huge policy hurdle that we all have to face on these technologies.
Yeah. And to follow up on that, I think some things to consider is, being regulated, the state of Alaska, the regulatory commission, like many regulatory commissions, it tends to be a conservative body. So change is something that is approached with caution, we'll say. But, we also have to contend with, what I would call the other standard regulatory mantras: cost causer, cost payer. We also have to have fair and equitable treatment for the membership and for your customers. So under those guidelines, it's not surprising that, if you want to change regulations, it is a 2-year process. If you want to accelerate that, the utilities do have the ability to come to the commission and ask for an inception rate. The problem with inception rates is that can be a very expensive proposition to develop data, because it's going to have to be one of the standards in the regulatory world is if the utility comes to the commission, the burden of proof is borne by the utility. So you have to have some data to go forward with this. And odds are it could very well turn into a docket, which turns into a 6-month proceeding to go through. And I can tell you from personal experience that dockets do not come cheap. and so, if you're at the utility, then the question becomes, do I want to go through the process of an inception rate and all that will entail for what may be potentially affecting, say, a handful of members for a number of years until adoption takes off? And these are some of the questions that, we have to wrestle with. Just wanted to add that.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. It's another example to me of how Alaska, we have a challenge being small. We're not PJM, which can spread its regulatory proceedings costs over what I don't know, 30 million people, right? So it really gets down to a cost per member of going to the RCA is not trivial at all. So really appreciate hearing that perspective and reinforcing it. Does anyone else? Go ahead, Matt.
So one interesting thing about heating in Alaska, most of rural Alaska is, and like I mentioned too, the larger cost burden tends to be heating fuel for homes and businesses in rural Alaska. And I think in Anchorage and places, the heating source is natural gas. And I believe the RCA has some oversight on the natural gas pricing. I could be wrong about that, but in rural Alaska, heating fuel is not regulated by anybody. It's just a free market. And a lot of times there's monopolies. And so basically you pay whatever the barge brings because you don't have a choice. You pay whatever they ask. You try to get some competition, but it's tough. So out here, in terms of how we're pricing, I guess some of our and providing rates for beneficial electrification energy is based on, what they're paying for heating fuel. So if they're paying, say, $9 a gallon for heating fuel, we may provide them the equivalent heat at a cost of, say, $5 a gallon, or $6 or $7 a gallon, based on how interruptible it is and how frequent it is. So that's kind of how we're approaching it, is how can we help reduce our members' cost burden by providing a more competitive cost to heating fuel.
That's great. Josh, I can't resist following up on your point, which is sort of near and dear to my heart, that, as you put it very succinctly, there is no tariff for ancillary services that you know of. And I guess my question is that something we need to tackle head on? And sort of tied to that is, do we need to even potentially have new statutory guidance to help with some of this innovation, as opposed to just the RCA writing regs within the statutory umbrella that we have?
Okay, you're probably entering a realm that is way above my pay grade, but I'll attempt to answer. From a statutory perspective, go ahead, Steve.
Shot.
All right. So from a statutory perspective, if we're trying to get the legislature to introduce some new statute or rule, we're still talking about at least a year or two of getting it through the legislative body in order for that to be put before the RCA. And even then, the RCA then has to take whatever that new statute is and design regulations around it. So we're still talking about a fairly lengthy process. I'm not saying that it wouldn't be helpful in some cases, but still probably a fairly lengthy process to get all of that through. And I'm sorry, was there the second part of your question?
Well, I think I can throw this to everybody. If it's understandable, the question is, and it goes back to Tim Leach's question, what policy changes might be? Is our policy and regulatory framework up to the job of accommodating and maybe even embracing some of these new technologies and new opportunities in the technological space of beneficial electrification? Tough question, but you guys are champions, so have at it.
So I do know, the method that we used to adopt the EV facility rate was by implementing an inception rate, which is a quicker route. It does allow us to do things that where the time and cost really comes in, at least as it's explained to me, and Daniel and JD probably know this more than I do, is if we have to do a full rate case study, that is hundreds of thousands of dollars minimum. And 12, 18 months to go through. And that's if we want to do a full rate case. So what we're really trying to stick with is this conservative kind of baby steps approach with inception rates in order to understand it better, to get this conservative body familiar with the rates that are and the technology that are coming in. I would say, I don't know that the regulations provide a barrier to, say, heat pump adoption or EV adoption from just putting the load on the system. The real issues start becoming, at the root of a lot of the issues that we might see is this cost causer, cost payer issue. And so one thing that I've tried to talk with quite a bit recently is, if we have, say, a 25 kVA transformer with 5 members on it, and somebody goes and puts an 11 kilowatt level 2 charger on there, there's no issue. I mean, we're still going to be able to service all that load pretty easily. But the second person that puts a level 2 charger on there at 11 kW, we probably start having issues with transformer loading. So the first person was able to do it. The second person now has to pay for a transformer upgrade. And that's inherent in just the regulatory process and the tariffs that we have is cost causer, cost payer. But, we talked a lot about equitable solutions earlier in this. I don't know that that is the most equitable approach, but I don't have a very good solution at this point. I am trying to talk with folks whenever I can about how do we deal with that, but I don't know that there is a solid solution out there yet. Even some of the costs, even down to the member itself, is do you have to upgrade your service entrance from older homes that have a 100 amp service entrance to maybe they need a 200 amp service entrance to service that new 50 amp level 2 charger. And I know I'm using up all the time here, so I'll stop talking, but these are some of the issues that come with the new technologies: is upgraded service entrances, upgraded lines, the need for transformer upgrades. I'm not necessarily saying we're going to have to upgrade our substations right away from this, but in 5 or 10 years, it may change our planning, that we may see certain substations jump ahead of other ones, or certain feeders need to be upgraded due to specific growth. So I think a lot of this is going to need to be addressed from a contractor perspective, making sure the contractors actually know what an air source heat pump is, making sure that they plan for EVs in the electric vehicle infrastructure, or in the electric infrastructure of the house. Because a 200 amp service entrance might do it, but you might need a sub panel, or you may need a second meter on the home just to accommodate some of these things. So those are a lot of the kind of really close to home issues that I'm trying to get people to talk about more.
Fantastic. Anyone else want to jump on that? That was a great list, Josh.
I can throw in just 30 seconds of something, a different piece. A lot of lower 48 utilities have the, I'll put air quotes around it, opportunity of really expensive power when they hit their peaks. And those lower 48 are connected to utilities from far away. And so to meet those peaks, they just buy really expensive power for the handful of hours a year or dozens of hours at really high rates. So they have that opportunity cost that's really high that they can offset. In the Railbelt, we're standalone, we're interconnected, but standalone. And so we have to meet that peak regardless. And so that gets back to that, our peak avoided cost that we're trying to, or our avoided costs throughout the hours of the day are fairly level. And we don't have this incredibly high peak that provides an opportunity to say, hey, we can give you more money if you can get off peak at this point in time. So that kind of presents a certain challenge for us, but something that we, I think with time of use rates, for example, if the need is there, for example, if a whole bunch of EVs are coming on and going to create a problem, we can work around that. But at this point, our costs are pretty level across many hours of the day.
Thanks, Sean. Michelle, do we get an extra 30 seconds?
Yes, Steve, extra 30 seconds.
Just for me. So I think out of courtesy and respect for Graham, if you're still here, you've shared your time from far away and outside our system. I'd like to give you essentially the last word. Is there anything that we Alaskans should take away, or anything that really strikes you as different from your situation versus ours? Looks like Graham may have left the scene. So, Josh, you get the last word, and it will be the last.
Well, I
word.
was just going
to. Thanks.
I mentioned the cost causer, cost payer issue and said that we didn't necessarily have a good solution there. My solution right now is I'm trying to look at, correctly sizing transformers and other stuff for the future. Maybe our design guide, instead of we using a 25 kVA transformer, we use a 50 kVA. The marginal costs on that installation are relatively low. There are additional parasitic loads, but it's just about trying to right size some of that equipment and just trying to look forward as opposed to looking back. And that's, I think, the approach that I'm taking right now, at least. And Graham is back if you want to give him the last word.
Randy, the charger.
Michelle is nodding. So Graham, we wanted to give you the last word since you've been so gracious sharing from outside our state. And the last word can be anything, but it might be, what is most different between Alaska and Vermont, or what should we be most mindful of that you've already learned?
Yeah, I don't think there's a secret formula for doing this. I think if anything, we've taken an approach of trying things for real in the wild, with real customers, and being a little willing to fail and make mistakes, which I know is not in utilities blood normally, but this stuff is new and it's changing fast. And I think that's really the best way to figure it out, is to start small, scale, make changes if things don't work out. And I think that's kind of been our mantra, as well as just keeping things simple for customers. They have enough to deal with if they're trying to think about optimizing against a dynamically fluctuating rate. It's probably not going to go very well. So taking some of the complexity out of their hands, but just not letting perfect be the enemy of the good, and trying things small and scaling up from there.
All right, we are out of time. What a great panel this was. I'm so grateful to all of you, and I think all of us in this workshop are so grateful to all of you for sharing your time and your thoughts. And Michelle, I'll just turn it back to you with a big thumbs up to these panelists who've shared so much great information.
Thank you so much, Steve, and thank you everybody on the utility panel. I really appreciate that. I love that we worked the equity questions into there. I know that the fourplex I live in is connected to a 25 kVA transformer with a 7-plex, so that's 11 units on what might be a single family home, and that's great because apartment users don't use a lot of electricity, but when everybody has a heat pump and electric vehicle, then that is a huge equity issue if those tenants are going to be paying through their landlord for those upgrades. So appreciate all of the perspectives and all of the different technology and equity issues that were addressed in that. We're excited to dive into our final session. So panel 4 will include 5 presentations followed by a group question and answer session. So we're really excited about this session. We've heard from early adopters. Hopefully we've heard some successes, or we did hear some successes, but also some pain points there. We heard from researchers about what the cutting edge research in the beneficial electrification area is. We heard from those 2 groups yesterday, and this morning we talked to panelists from the electric utilities and about some policy and programs and what their thoughts are around this coming revolution in how we get and use energy. And so now we're going to talk to people in industry, or hear from people in industry, and have a chance to enter into conversation with them about some of the innovations that are on the market or coming to market that can help us with this transition, and hopefully help make it as beneficial and equitable as possible as we move to electrifying some of our energy use. So as a reminder, during this session, questions can be submitted via the chat box and will be addressed either during the Q&A or in the chat. Please join me in welcoming our final moderator, who will be introducing our panel 4 participants. Please welcome Professor of Sustainable Energy and Principal for UAF Bristol Bay Campus, and also with Kempe Energetics, Chandler Kemp.
Thanks, Michelle. And thanks everybody for joining into this panel. I'm really excited for the group of speakers we have today. We have representatives from fleet electrification for electric buses. We're going to be speaking about electrification in the marine and aviation industries, as well as some of the building efficiency and demand side measures that we can consider. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. He's John Hallowell. He's a senior technical executive and team member in the Electric Transportation Group of Electric Power Research Institute, where his focus is smart charging and infrastructure development for plug-in electric vehicles. He joined EPRI, that's the Electric Power Research Institute, in 2007, and has been active in the electric transportation space since 2008. John is the current chair of the SAE J1772 Electric Vehicle Conductive Charge Coupler Task Force and co-chair of the SAE AE7D Aircraft Energy Storage and Charging Committee. And so with that, go ahead and unmute yourself, John, and take it away.
All right. Thank you, Chandler. I appreciate it very much. Thank you for the invite here to talk today. We're going to touch on several different technologies in this panel. I'm going first, and I'm going to be talking about really thinking about consumer vehicles, so light duty vehicles. Really want to think about what are the challenges there and what are the opportunities. And I just have one slide. I wanted to have something in the background there for you to think about. So I'm hoping the generation that this young man belongs to won't have to go through some of the pain we're going to go through, I think, over the next few years in adopting EVs. But let me talk about that a little bit. So I'm going to come from the perspective that an electric vehicle is pretty compelling on its own. That is, they're fun to drive, they're quiet, they have good acceleration, they meet the consumer's needs. We're seeing the variety of vehicles and the availability of vehicles increasing pretty much across the board. Going from small hatchbacks now up to pickup trucks, and we're seeing the gaps in those different types of vehicles filling in. They're not cost competitive, up front when you go to a dealership to buy one. If you look at your total cost of ownership, there are some that are, getting where, if you count in the fuel cost, that they are becoming, more competitive. So that's an area of challenge that we'll see, change over time. But ample variety, they are compelling, to sell. Then what are the challenges remaining? Well, to me, the biggest difference is what this picture is showing, which is fueling the vehicle. How do you put charge back into an electric vehicle? And how different that is than how we fuel a vehicle now. It's different. People think about those that have gas cars. If you ask them about EVs and they've not given it a lot of thought, they're going to be taking that gas station model in mind and sort of applying that to the electric vehicle. And that misses the whole opportunity of a vehicle like the one in this picture sitting in someone's driveway being charged at home at night or when it's idle. That's probably the big opportunity in EVs, is the fact that they can charge when they're idle. And my analogy is to try and tell people, think more about your cell phone. I don't know how long my cell phone takes to charge because I plug it in at night, and when I wake up in the morning, it works, right? And if I have a really long day of travel and maybe I'm using my phone a lot, maybe I need a fast charger somewhere, like to top off my phone. Very similar to how we would operate an EV. So to me, there's a lot of education that needs to be done for our consumers. The whole notion that you would just buy an EV and then use it like a gas car, so you're going to always travel to a fast charger somewhere to charge that vehicle. First of all, it sort of defies the economics. I caught the tail end of the last session and talking about just the challenges of, say, upgrading transformers in neighborhoods. Well, the impacts of charging are certainly more prominent the higher the power level. So when we talk about fast charging a vehicle at 200,000 watts, that's going to have a higher cost to the distribution system and to the size of a transformer, the size of wires, the size of equipment. So you're not going to be able to deliver 200 kilowatts to a vehicle as cheaply as you can 7 or 8 kilowatts at home or at a workplace or in a parking lot where the car is idle. That notion that fuel has a cost based on time is not something that consumers are familiar with. Electricity costs more if delivered at high power, and that's very different than gasoline fueling. So that's something we need to help consumers understand. We've noticed car makers, and I assume this would happen, that there's always going to be my car charges faster than your car. So the drive toward having really high power charging at home, even if a consumer really doesn't need it, but just having that comfort of having that high power capacity at home, we need to educate people that has consequences, not just to them, but to the entire electric system. And some of those decisions we make, with like wanting a 19 kilowatt charger at your house when 7 kilowatts or even 3 kilowatts might meet your needs. Those are the kind of things where education, I think, plays a really important role. I guess one other area that I think about is, I live in a single family home, so adding a charger to my house wasn't a huge challenge. If you live in an apartment house, I remember asking my son, would he consider an EV? And he said, hey, Dad, I live in an apartment. Where would I charge it? And he's right. That's a challenge right now. If you live in multi-unit dwellings, if you live in a condo or an apartment complex or a high-rise building, there are challenges with how will we charge your car. If you have to rely totally on fast charging, right now that probably will make the economics of an electric vehicle very poor, again, because that high power charging is always going to cost more than that ability to charge, at home at night. I guess the other one that comes to mind for, particularly when I think about Alaska, so for your region, would be cold weather impacts. We certainly see how that impacts the range of an EV. I have a Nissan Leaf, which is one of the early vehicles that has a fairly small battery. And so the significance to me driving is big. I see my range drop by a very large percentage of its normal, like, typical day range, like from 100 miles down to maybe 50 if it's really cold out. That impact is lessened when you have a vehicle that has a larger battery. When you look at a vehicle that has a 300-mile range or a 400-mile range, that impact of the cold weather isn't as important. But there's also some things I've learned, like in a gasoline car, because you have waste heat from the engine, which represents 60% of the energy that you put into the vehicle is coming off as heat. Heating a car in winter is pretty easy, pretty low cost, and has very little impact on the vehicle's range. For an electric vehicle, things like having a heat pump instead of just a conventional air conditioner can help. But also teaching drivers that, just heating your seat, heating the steering wheel. I've actually found it more pleasant when I'm wearing a coat and I get in a cold EV. If the seat is heated and the steering wheel is heated, I don't really need the cabin heat as much. Just having that hot air, I've actually found it uncomfortable in some gasoline vehicles where the cabin heats up too much and you're wearing a coat and you find yourself sweating. So there are ways to approach it just through education about, how you heat your car. And companies have certainly learned to do things like heating seats as opposed to trying to heat the entire contents of a vehicle. Things like, preheating your car at home before you leave. That's one I fell in love with. My Nissan heats the steering wheel, and I would come out on a cold day and grab that warm steering wheel. And my wife was very envious of my heated steering wheel. So, it's funny sometimes the things that will compel us to buy a car, and it's not always, the specifications, but it can be those little edge cases. So most of the things I've talked about, really come back to, if you want to see consumers adopt EVs, and you talk to people outside the bubble. So I work in the EV world a lot, and if I go out and talk to people outside the bubble, like I go to a friend at church or at work that doesn't do cars, and I ask them, what do you think about EVs? And I almost always get that, they take too long to charge. They cost too much. There's the sort of normal things. Well, if you're thinking about standing there while the car is slow charging at night, yeah, it probably takes too long. I generally don't sit out in my driveway and watch my Leaf charge at night. It does that on its own. I don't watch my cell phone charge, right? But I'm thinking of the gas model again. I'm thinking about, I got to be there when I'm fueling my car. So that autonomy that you can charge an EV without having to be present, that's something we need to educate people. And, even if EVs are compelling, if the cars themselves are compelling, if consumers don't see a sufficient volume of charging stations and they don't understand how they operate and they don't see how it fits their lifestyle, the vehicles won't sell. People are not going to make that leap on an investment that is so much money. We're talking now $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 to invest in a vehicle. And that's a pretty big leap, I think, for most consumers to put that much money out and not be really sure it's going to meet my needs. So that, to try and move people from a technology they know and understand, which, fueling with gasoline or diesel, that's a challenge to move them to something that, is just different. And I think there's a big role for education. And if consumers try to apply the gas model, I think they're going to be disappointed. I think EVs will disappoint if you try to use them like a gas vehicle. If you don't find a place to charge them when they're idle, it's just not going to have the economic scale that it could have if you have the lower cost, low speed charging. That education opportunity is what I kind of wanted to close on. Who's going to do that? Are automakers going to teach people this? Is it going to be the salespeople at a car lot, where they have lots of turnover and people maybe are in those jobs just for a few months? Is it going to be the utility? You're a trusted energy advisor to some consumers. So could you have an opportunity? You're neutral. You don't sell cars. You could help educate people. And I think of the young man in this photo, his generation may grow up thinking how crazy we were, that we were working with a flammable, explosive liquid that we manipulated and put in vehicles. How crazy is that? So I think it comes back to educating people on the technology. We have electric vehicle service providers, those that do the charging networks. They can provide education. And I think it's probably all of these players are going to have to be involved. Automakers have to educate consumers. Our dealerships have to train their staff so that their staff is comfortable selling you an electric vehicle. I've always put myself in the shoes of a car salesperson. You come in and you want to buy a car. If I sell you an electric car and it doesn't meet your needs, it literally just won't meet your lifestyle. That's a pretty big fail. It probably will, potentially you'll be back at the car lot. You'll be angry. Maybe it costs my job as a salesperson. Certainly it's not going to help my business. So I think there's that real fear of like placing a consumer in something that doesn't meet their needs. So we need to educate car salespeople. We need to really get that word out about how the vehicles are fueled, how that has advantages over a gas vehicle. The fact that a vehicle can fuel while it's idle. I'll leave you with a couple stats. One is that most of us drive less than 40 miles a day. And that if you look at a typical car, that's about 12 kilowatt hours, somewhere in that ballpark. That's maybe $1.20 and 10 cents a kilowatt hour utility areas. That's pretty inexpensive. The other stat is that vehicles sit idle more than roughly 22 hours a day for most of us. That's not true if you're on a long trip, but certainly while you're talking about things like home charging. So to me, it's like there's this big opportunity for education. The challenge is how do we get people to take a car that we see as superior in terms of performance? How do we fuel it and be comfortable with that? So I'll stop there. I think we've got a couple minutes. If you wanted to ask questions, happy to take those.
Thanks so much, John. We're going to try to stay to a tight schedule on this right now. So we're going to hold questions for you until the end of the session.
That works.
But we will have time then for a bit of a discussion. So our next speaker will be Michael Collender. So Mike manages the development of fleet electrification projects for Highland. Previously, Mike worked in investment banking where he advised companies in the renewable energy and advanced mobility sectors. Mike is a veteran of the U.S. Army. He led the Caisson platoon in Arlington National Cemetery and served as a paratrooper overseas. And he continues to serve in the Army Reserve. Mike holds a bachelor's degree in finance from Tulane University and an MBA from Cornell University. And he's training for his first marathon and committed to perfecting his tomato sauce recipe. So thanks so much for participating here, Mike. And I look forward to hearing your presentation.
I'm Mike, Director of Fleet Solutions. So kind of the front end of stuff, structuring projects. And with me, Sean Leach.
Hey everybody, Sean Leach, Manager of Training and Fleet Operations. Once Mike makes the project come together and makes it pencil for our customer, at the very end, I take it over and make sure the charging infrastructure is working, the bus is working, customer's happy for the life of the contract. So you've got both ends of a very big electrification effort.
Yeah. All right. There's an electric school bus in a sunnier area than up there in Alaska. But if we jump to the next slide, we see why we think it makes sense to lead the electrification transition with school bus. And there's three main pillars. The first is the most predictable fleet asset out there. You have defined routes. They're doing them twice a day, 2 to 3 hours at a time, and they usually sit there all summer. The range is pretty short. There's some rural areas for sure in Alaska that are pushing past 100 miles per day, but most of them, 60 to 80 miles per day is pretty attainable, even in very cold weather. And lastly, they're uniformly located. So you can take a utility drop, put in a new transformer, and electrify, 10 to 50 school buses quite efficiently, both cost and operationally wise. The second thing that we're really excited about is they're versatile. These are enormous batteries, about 200 kilowatt hours, and they're pretty underutilized. If you look at the duty schedule, they're usually just sitting there. They charge overnight, pretty low output, and then they discharge twice a day. And all summer long, where a lot of, the most expensive peak demands happen, they're available to push electricity back to the grid through a vehicle to grid. We can talk a little bit more about that at the end. We've done that in Massachusetts, and we have a project almost online in Vermont.
Yep. With Graham.
Yeah, with Graham, who you all just met. And lastly, they're very available, especially for fleet vehicles. If we jump to the next slide, you'll see there's a bunch out there. They look just like normal school buses. Most of the OEMs rip out the diesel powertrain, and they retrofit it with custom battery packs from various suppliers. And again, they're massive batteries. They're all made in the U.S. There is one Canadian manufacturer, but they're building an Illinois-based manufacturing. Sorry about that. Give us 1 second.
Sorry about that, gang.
All set.
Is everybody still there? Good?
Yeah,
Yep.
I think we're good.
Continue.
And then lastly, diesel abatement. If you're trying to calculate emissions, the emissions from a diesel powertrain and engine are vastly more impactful than a gasoline ICE engine. So, rule of thumb, about it takes about 5 light utility vehicles being taken off the road to equal 1 school bus coming off the road. If we jump to the next slide, just some fun facts for Alaska. Roughly 1,000 school buses in Alaska. Huge state with about 55 public school districts. So they're pretty sparse, a lot of rural routes, and then of course some heavily concentrated areas as well. But if you put all those together, you're looking at about 200 megawatt hours of battery capacity, which is meaningful in most locations, and especially in Alaska. We've done a little bit of analysis with Michelle and the others here on the impact of that, and we're pretty excited about it. Lastly, we don't think every school bus should be electric tomorrow. Maybe 10, 15 years from now, that makes sense. But every fleet, about a quarter of them, of the routes are ready to electrify now or in the next few years. So that's where we put our focus, right? Electrify where it makes sense and programmatically expand to whatever full percentage makes sense.
One other thing I just want to add to the available bus types, our slide previously touched on largely the newer buses. So if you want to buy a brand new, fresh off the factory line, fully electric bus, that is a great option and usually the one we start with. But Highland is very actively pursuing right this second repowering existing buses, including buses as old as 10 plus years. Recognizing that not every school district and not every contract can, afford a new school bus. And also, frankly, the carbon footprint of taking an existing bus and repowering it is better. So we really want to be able to do whatever our customers need us to do to electrify their fleet. If that's new buses, great. If it's repower buses and upgrading, great. We'll work on one, either, or both.
Exactly. And the shuttle buses too, they're available. I mean, we focus on the yellow school bus. But they're available in any color for any number of purposes. So if there's a municipal or touring company, anything transporting people, those are pretty efficient cost-wise for electrification as well. If we jump to the next slide, the real challenge we at Highland are trying to solve for school districts and fleet managers is really twofold. One is the upfront cost of a school bus right now for an electric powertrain is about 3 times the cost, which is an eye-watering number. Now we can get that down with retrofits, but we, in our model, which we'll get into in a second, tries to solve that. The second thing we're solving is the complexity of it all. You're transitioning from an internal combustion engine, liquid fuel-based logistics system to electric fleets, which need a gas station at every parking lot, right, or every parking space. So that's what we're solving for. And the way we do that in the next slide is taking that burden largely off the fleet managers. You see the current electrification model, they got to piecemeal it together with grants, go out, get contractors, do engineering in themselves or outsource it. What we offer is a fleet as a service. So we'll come in similar to a power purchase agreement for distributed energy asset like solar, and we'll capitalize everything up front, the bus, the charger, the design build of the infrastructure. Build it all up front. We capitalize it on the private sector balance sheet and then offer a flat fixed fee for, call it 10 years. And that includes the maintenance on the bus, the electricity usage. So we become the utility's new favorite customer in many, many instances. The school district never actually sees the electricity bill. They just pay us that fixed annual fee. And we help training of the drivers, the maintainers. We like to take a whole of community approach to make it an easy, affordable, and transition that makes sense for everyone.
We also like to, we're spinning this up very quickly, but the software component's also big as well. We'll train you guys on our unified software platform that marries all the bus telemetry data with all the charging data. Again, you don't have to do anything you want to in there, but we can give you full access and visibility over all the assets. We can also custom tailor reports and dashboards for different people inside the organization. So there could be a grant manager that wants to see certain stats about carbon offsets or how much diesel fuel is offset. There could be someone who really cares about energy use and time of day, excuse me. So we can really customize the solution for each customer so that they see as much or as little as they care to. Again, recognizing that Highland's business is to handle all of this for you. So we'll hand over anything you need us to, but at the end of the day, we will make sure this project goes well and that bus is ready for each route.
Yeah. Kind of the premise behind it on the next slide is we think about this as a transfer of risk, the incremental risk of going from a diesel fuel source to a electric vehicle powertrain. And I think on slide 7, it should kind of show how we think about that. Yeah, so if you segment risk into operational risk and then the actual financial risk, Highland's public-private partnership for schools and municipalities, we take most of the operational risk and all of the financial risk of the incremental transition to electric through the design build of the infrastructure, the charger. We believe charging is the most important aspect of electrification, because if it doesn't work, obviously nothing else does. And Sean does a great job with our partners and our software and charge management suite to make sure that they're always up and running. And then the financial risk, we essentially act as a lifetime warranty for the bus as long as it's under contract with us. So if the battery goes out after warranty, we take the hit. The only thing we're not doing is driving the bus. We think most fleet managers are better positioned to manage their local stakeholders and labor. We'll wrap up here quick. Just next slide, showing a little bit of what we do. If you're interested in electric buses, this map on the left is an interactive map with the World Resource Institute. They have an electric bus initiative. It's great. And each of those bubbles you can click into, and it shows you where all current electric bus projects are in the US. If you key in on the big green circle, that's our landmark project in Maryland, just outside of the capital, contracted for 326 buses rolled out over 4 years. By far the largest heavy duty electric vehicle project in the States right now. And then just to show some quick pictures, we love to talk about vehicle to grid, vehicle to anything. We participated in a commercial program with National Grid over the summer and actively working with Green Mountain Power in Vermont to test cold weather V2G. And then just a picture of our first depot in Bethesda, Maryland, with 45 DC fast chargers in a single line route. We'll pause here for questions. I can't see the timer. I don't know how much time we have if we're over, but we'd love to.
Yeah, thanks so much for that presentation. We're right on schedule, so we're going to keep forging ahead and hold questions till the panel at the end here. But thank you for the presentation. And our next speaker will be Brice Soku. Brice manages a portfolio of responsibilities at Ampere, all aimed at defining and developing products for an electric aviation future. That includes go-to-market strategy, customer outreach, and business development. Brice has led successful bid proposals for NASA-supported development of Ampere's hybrid powertrain technology. He led the project with Hawaii's Elemental Accelerator to demonstrate the first airline trials of a hybrid electric aircraft. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Brice. You can go ahead and unmute yourself and kick off your presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone, and glad to be here today. So today we're going to talk about the future of sustainable air travel and how it's actually a lot nearer term than a lot of people might think. So at Ampere, we're decarbonizing traditional aviation. Our vision is a sustainable future for all air travel with energy optimized aircraft that make flying clean, quiet, and affordable. And we really clue in on those last 3 points: clean, quiet, and affordable. All those 3 things have to come together in order for kind of the large market adoption. So when we talk about Ampere's path forward, we're talking about an energy optimization approach for aircraft, and that's really specific to each aircraft type that we pursue. So we're doing this in a pragmatic way by upgrading existing aircraft, much like we heard from Highland on upgrading existing buses from combustion to electric, we're doing the same thing for aircraft. So this is really enabled by the underlying technology, leveraged from a lot of the developments in the EV, ground EV industry. So we're utilizing electrical propulsion where it is most impactful. We believe this is actually scalable to all aircraft categories. You'll see in a second that we're starting small, but we have ambitions for larger aircraft like you see here that could fit 30 to 50 passengers. This could apply to either freshly built aircraft in factories or existing airframes, which the existing airframes will be our first step. And we envision a future in which all of our aircraft are compatible with sustainable aviation fuel, further reducing the environmental impact. So speaking about impact, mixing or combining SAF, sustainable aviation fuel, with hybrid having on order 50 to 70% reduction in fuel consumption, and then switching that fuel over to SAF, you can actually get upwards of 75%, and we calculated even upwards of 90% of total life cycle emissions reduction. So in that scenario, we're not only talking about, or rather, we're much closer to kind of this zero tailpipe emissions or zero life cycle emissions for the all-electric aircraft that are in the industry. So ultimately, we believe that this first practical step, upgrading existing planes, going hybrid, and also using sustainable aviation fuel, has tremendous potential for really decarbonizing existing routes and allowing for effectively carbon neutral or almost carbon neutral expansion. So in terms of transformation, we believe this really accelerates the urban air mobility. We're targeting this kind of 50 to 500 mile range with our aircraft, and again, focusing on fixed wing. So this enables optimized aircraft types. Again, we're using a lot less energy to get from point A to point B. And we're also establishing an underlying technology foundation for true zero emission air travel, which is the future. So looking at our roadmap, today, we've flown 2 versions of our 6-seat hybrid demonstrator based off a Cessna 337 Skymaster. We call it the Electric Eel. And that's been flying since 2019. And currently we have a program with ARPA-E, through the Department of Energy, to use that aircraft as a test bed for novel electrification technologies targeted for aviation. But more exciting, I think, is our launch product, which is the Eco Caravan, targeting for entry into service in 2024. This is an upgraded version of the existing aircraft. There are hundreds or of them flying around in Alaska. So really, we want to be able to decarbonize a lot of the air travel and lifelines, really, for certain communities out in Alaska. Then scaling up the technology to 19-seater platform, looking at plug-in hybrid. That's, as battery technology improves, then we're able to provide more energy for effectively the same mass. And so we can have a higher percentage hybrid vehicle. And then long-term, we want to scale this technology up to large aircraft, like we mentioned before, in the kind of 50 to 100 seat passenger size, as well as look at opportunities for clean sheet designs that would be that would really incorporate really novel technologies, both from an aerodynamic perspective and also from an electrification component perspective. So what have we been doing today? So we really are the industry leaders in hybrid electric aircraft. We've worked with the FAA, gotten 10 experimental airworthiness certificates, and the first hybrid aircraft to receive the kind of elevated market survey category for experimental. Now, these airworthiness certificates, aren't full commercial approvals to operate kind of revenue generating service. But they are indications that we've worked with the FAA, and the FAA has agreed that our aircraft is safe to fly. And so we've worked with multiple organizations, including NASA, US Air Force, ARPA-E, collaborations with Textron. We've flown in the UK, we've flown in Scotland, and really all of that time, and I think when we calculated it, it was over 11,000 nautical miles so far of kind of distance on both of our aircraft platforms. And we've seen effectively 100% dispatch reliability from our electric system. The only issues that we have on the plane maybe are like a flat tire, brake change, or maybe even a hydraulic leak. So kind of the traditional aviation systems where you focused on maintenance, but no maintenance required on our electric system. And we've demonstrated for, admittedly, what isn't a fully energy optimized aircraft, a really powerful 38% savings in terms of fuel. So talking more about our launch product, the Eco Caravan, we really look at the lens through which we look at the industry is really through risk. And so we want to minimize risk to really increase the customer adoption in virtually all the categories. So in terms of regulatory risk, we're pursuing an engine upgrade, not a new build aircraft. And also we're pursuing hybrid, which has still some combustion element, which regulators are really comfortable with. This still provides an amazing value proposition, 50 to 70% reduction in fuel consumption, with up to 25% reduction in total operating costs. That's transformational for any airline. Minimizing infrastructure risk. Our architecture allows the aircraft to be charged in the air. It's from the combustion system. So it works much like a Prius does. So with that, we're able to scale out infrastructure in a very meaningful way and concentrate infrastructure maybe in the places or the airports where it's needed and not requiring it at each one of your origin or destination points. And lastly, minimize adoption risk. The reason why hybrid provides so much value, we think, to customers is because you get payload. With the current state of batteries today, you would not have enough payload to make these aircraft useful. So this allows seamless, near immediate network applicability for any operator out there. So our focus has always been engineering and not science. So we're building our aircraft with state-of-the-art components that don't require breakthrough technology. So we've kind of blurred the system. It's an early prototype there, but I can tell you that it's a combustion system integrated fully with an electric system that has the electric engine, power electronics, etc. We've actually tested this multiple times and have even recently over the past few weeks and have even confirmed kind of regeneration. So our hybrid system works and it's providing the savings that we're expecting. So our technology utilizes batteries that are effectively, the state-of-the-art for today's cells. We don't need a magic battery. And our certification path is an STC path. So we don't need to certify everything on the airplane. We're just focusing with the FAA and other regulators, the modifications that we're making. So just an overview of the aircraft itself. We are maintaining, in the US at least, the top level of the available seats for the aircraft. So you could fly with 9 seats in this aircraft. You could fly with 9 seats in a conventional aircraft. So from an operator's perspective, they really do not lose anything. There's no real trade-off there when it comes to passengers. There may be trade-offs in other areas, speed in particular, but our target speed, cruise speed, about 145 to 150 knots, is still more than plenty for a lot of operators. Our payload is above 2,500 pounds for most of the routes for this particular aircraft. And so that enables actually significant cargo operations. And so our battery pack only takes up about the back third of the cargo pod underneath. So the cabin remains untouched and you still have a large portion of the cargo pod to transport cargo. We actually think that for cargo, all cargo aircraft operations, baselining the Caravan should and will go hybrid within the next few years. Our range number, 800 plus miles, that's actually half of what our true range is. Our true ferry range is something like 1,600 miles. But really for the useful portion of the payload that you would really use this aircraft for, 800 miles is plenty. So this is a 40 kilowatt hour battery pack with lithium ion based chemistry, as I mentioned, state of the art. And the combustion system that we're using is also type certificated. So that's really important. You don't have to kind of go through major regulatory hurdles with a lot of our systems. So in terms of different milestones to get this aircraft to commercial service, flight testing the second half of this year, with certification targeted by at the end of mid-2024, really. And just really quickly, I'll just go, actually, I'll skip this slide. Pretty much this slide just says, running short on time here, you can charge in the air, you can choose not to charge in the air, saving a little bit more money, or you could use all the electric system and save even more money. So that's really, really great. Certification path all the way through 2024 again, and that's it. And looking forward to the questions at the end.
Thank you, Reese. We have a few questions in the chat, and we'll bring those up in the panel as much as we can. Our next speaker here is going to be Jan Klock. Jan lives in Norway on the northwestern coast, close to the town of Ålesund. He has 32 years of marine experience, where he sailed as an engineer on tankers and offshore supply ships. Jan also worked for Rolls-Royce Marine in various jobs within propulsion and integrated systems. So I'm really excited to hear from Jan about his work with Norway Electric Systems and the electric ferry development that's happening there. So go ahead and unmute yourself, Jan. I see you already have. Take it away. Thank you.
Hello, and good morning, or whatever it is over there. It's evening time here. So let's get started. Excited to hear your presentations on the various topics. Over here in Norway, we've been through all that. So Norwegian Electric Systems is a system integration company, really. So what we do is we kind of get the systems to work together. This is what I'm going to talk about, who we are and what are the challenges we face, and what do we need to do when we integrate power systems, and also standardization. It will that will touch into the topics we've heard about before on buses, on the utility grids and all that. You need to agree upon a standard that everybody can use, really. Started in 2009, global supplier of advanced diesel electric systems, hybrid electric systems, and 100% electric systems. We merged with a company called Norwegian Control Systems, completing the product range with the integrated automation systems and the power management, and also bridge and navigation systems. Important position both nationally and internationally in several market segments. I'll be mostly talking about ferries today. This is our R&D development from 2008 and up to now. So yeah, we can talk more about that later on if anybody's interested in that. Let's go back. So we talk about energy design. I like to compare that to the first time you're going to cook your Christmas dinner and the in-laws are there. There's a lot of expectations to this meal. Your mother-in-law's been cooking it for years and she knows what it's going to taste like and what's going to be there. And you've got the other side of the family that are kind of used to other things. So it's all about meeting everybody's expectations. You have the ship owner with the expectations on fuel consumption, energy consumption, and running hours on various machinery. You also have the grid companies on how much you're going to be taking off the grid, and in some cases how much you're going to be putting back into the grid from these charging systems. And it's all about looking at this in a different way. You need to turn every stone there is to turn. And then when you've done that, you turn 2 more. You look into vessel design, the way you propel the vessel, the way you charge the vessel. How can you combine, as you've talked about here, car charging? All these things kind of come into play and benefit the whole community rather than just this single vessel or this project. By doing this, you have the batteries you can see here, or you have the propellers, you have the engines, and the DC switchboard and the AC switchboard. And of the vessel, you see the outline here. There's 4 of those under construction as we speak. 1 is already in operation. The second one's ready to go. The 4th and last one will have hydrogen fuel cells on board. And we're a part of that project to see how we can do that. So this vessel is capable of 10 hours of zero emission operation. To do all this with the energy system, with the batteries and the engines and the charging systems and that, you need a remote control, a smart control system. And this is a bit like your remote control for the TV. You can always get your TV to turn on and switch the channels by getting up and going over to the TV and physically doing it. What we do here is remote control everything. We do remote connection, disconnection, charging, power management, energy management, vessel performance. Everything is really highly automated, automatic crossing, and everything has a focus on saving energy. What this same job used X amount of kilowatt hours with the last ferry. This ferry is using Y amount of kilowatt hours less than the same one, and it's doing the same job, is really the idea of the whole thing. This is some of the new buildings we've done. Fully electric, all in operation. This one here is the last one. We successfully landed. It is the ferry between Rødby in Denmark and Puttgarden in Germany, and it's the longest zero emission run in the world. It runs for 2 hours and 40 minutes to Germany and back again to Denmark, and then charge in Denmark. And we also do the ferry terminal setup for the charging system on the for the vessel there in Denmark. So I heard a talk about 50 kVA transformers. Well, this one has a 500 MVA transformer for the system. So it is also the longest zero emission run, but also the highest capacity charging system in the world. And it is a ferry that transports trucks, not so much passenger cars. We've also retrofitted some ferries, hybrid, and we also have one with the sails, this one here. This one runs on a fixed route in the North Sea. It goes the same route all the year round, and they spent 3 years studying the wind and currents on that route. And actually, when it's very beneficial, they actually did 12 knots without any diesel being used. So they're going to do another one, and that's going to have 3 sails rather than 2. As I said, we also do charging stations for the ferries. So we do low voltage systems, high voltage, and DC systems. Especially on the AC systems, we do we feed back to the grid the reactive effect that balances the grid, so that we don't make everything kneel when the ferry connects. It's a fully automatic operation, and there's nobody is running around plugging in anything. This just kind of starts communicating with each other when the ferry gets close to the terminal, positioning the charging arms and and it works really good, really. So what are the challenges? We're back to the Christmas dinner. It's to meet and understand the expectation of the vessel owner. What was the designer's idea with this vessel? And it's important that we kind of start to interact early into this project, where we can give input on how to do things and how to be best energy efficient. So it's with these projects that there's a lot of what should I say, secrets and that being kept from the market, but it really needs the market and the customers to kind of contribute at an early stage and get the best technology into the vessel so that you can use less energy. That's really the whole thing about it. You can also think about the process of what we do is if you look at this photo here, it's the man with a golden helmet. And a lot of people think, well, you can get the batteries and you can get some frequency converters and the charging plug, and it's not that hard to do it. All these products are readily available in the market today. But if you start to look at the painting and you notice the details in how things are shadowed and the gaze of the guy and all this, the shine in the helmet, the shine in the armor, this kind of represents the details that you're going to meet in how do you do this? How do you drain the batteries? How do you fill them up? How do you best manage these systems so that you don't use more energy than you actually do? Because if you don't do it right, you can end up using more than what you did up front. So what we need to understand from the expectation is a vessel spec. A system description can be vague in many ways, but we need to have information on operational profiles, where they're going to put equipment, would they consider alternative setups, class regulations, notifications, any other requirements? What is the grid like on the shore side for the shore charging? Is it a weak grid? Is it a strong grid? And at the end of the day, it's all about, doing what we can with all these points and achieve smart, safe vessel operations. So what you can expect if we get early involved in a project is you'll have low energy consumption, and also you'll reduce your running hours, which is often not considered when you do these projects. But rather than running one engine versus 2 or 3, it kind of mounts up on your running hours and also shortens your maintenance schedule and the cost of operating the vessel. To what level of automation would you like to have in the vessel? As much as possible, I would say, but some operators like to have more of a human interface in some level, but to be honest, today it's going towards, we have auto crossing today, but it's moving towards auto docking as well, and auto mooring and all this.
I'm going to give you a 30-second warning here, Jan.
Yeah, various operation modes, bridge setup, external equipment for consideration, and other energy sources. So I'll just stop there if you like. Standardization, we'll talk a bit about that. They need to agree on a plug that would fit, so you could move the vessel around other ports and not be specific at one end and stuff like that. So this is the standardization we're looking for in ferries and wind farm vessels and all this. I guess I can stop. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Jan. We're really grateful to hear from you on this, and grateful for the leadership that Norway's had in the marine electrification space. Our final speaker for this session is Karma Sawyer. Dr. Sawyer is responsible for shaping and managing a vision and strategy. She works with Pacific Northwest National Lab and is an expert in some of their energy efficiency and clean energy efforts. Go ahead, Karma.
Thank you, Chandler. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all for giving me the opportunity to speak here today. Well, I know that I am the last speaker here, so I'll try to keep you all entertained so we can get to our conversation. As Chandler said, I am the Division Director for Electricity Infrastructure and Buildings at Pacific Northwest National Lab. So my personal expertise is in the building space. I've done quite a bit of work on demand response and similar efforts. But I also have oversight over our electricity infrastructure and power grid work, which is a key piece to having an electric power system that meets all of our needs, even if we do electrify everything and reach this decarbonized future that we've all been discussing today. So if you're not familiar with PNNL, it is one of the Department of Energy National Labs. There are 17 national labs total that are really a remarkable national resource for all of us. They grew out of the Manhattan Project, and they created an unprecedented science and technology capability that created the first atomic bomb. As DOE's mission evolved, so did the network of national labs, and the labs themselves are all unique and now support all of DOE's missions in scientific discovery, energy and national security, as well as environmental stewardship. If you don't know much about the DOE labs, I'm a total geek about it. I would strongly encourage you to look up some of this history because I do believe that it has really shaped the world and it's shaped our country, and hopefully will be one of the most powerful tools in reaching our decarbonized future. To give you a little bit more information about PNNL, where I work, our main campus is located in Richland, Washington. But we have offices in Seattle, Portland, Sequim, Washington, and in Washington, D.C., which is actually where I'm located. There are about 5,000 scientists, engineers, and support professionals at the lab. I work in the Energy and Environment Division, which has a very broad scope, but it includes work like developing new anodes to quadruple the lifespan of lithium sulfur batteries so they can be used for a broad range of storage options. But for the purposes of this presentation, we actually do quite a bit of work on commercially viable technologies that need to be investigated for their integration, to understand how they can be integrated into a broader system to be able to provide a wide range of energy services equitably across all communities in the US. So a little bit more about kind of this grand challenge that we spend our time thinking about. Climate change poses a significant risk to virtually all human and natural systems, either directly or indirectly. And reducing greenhouse gas emissions that are driving climate change are going to require huge changes in the energy systems, including sharp reductions in fossil fuels and a large increase in renewable energy. That transformation alone is a formidable societal challenge. But in addition to that, all of those energy systems are sensitive to environmental changes on various different timescales. And the decarbonized energy generation sources like wind, solar, and hydro, they're particularly sensitive because of intermittency and resource availability. Energy storage systems will surely be a part of the solution as we decarbonize and electrify, but those technologies, especially in the way that they are integrated throughout a system, are still emerging. As our keynote speaker talked about earlier today, there's also increasing awareness that the impacts of climate change and other externalities of energy production, as well as energy access, are just deeply intertwined with social justice concerns and have disproportionate impacts on disadvantaged groups. There is a strategy in the Biden administration called the America's All-In Principle to be able to decarbonize our society to meet their aggressive goals. And the first two are things that I wanted to highlight for you. The first is accelerating towards 100% clean electricity, decarbonizing electricity and all other energy supplies. And then you electrify everything, as we've been talking about. So transportation, buildings, industry, primarily through just straight electrification, but also energy efficiency. There is a third principle around enhancing ecosystems that I'm not going to talk about today. So I said a lot of the work that we do at PNNL is looking at these existing technologies and thinking about the way they can be deployed together and in real applications to be able to realize building electrification and decarbonization in a way that can support the entire power sector. In the case of, I'm just giving you a couple of kind of examples of what this might look like. In commercial buildings, we have done deployments that have shown that we can reduce energy costs by 10 to 20% and peak loads by 20% through advanced control technologies. We also have done research and are just starting to do demonstrations around how we can reduce peak loads by up to 80% in legacy equipment in existing homes. So there are 120 million existing homes in the US. I think it's one of the hardest segments of the buildings market, but there are control technologies that can help access that and have significant reductions on peak loads. We've been doing field demonstrations around connected water heaters to understand how different manufacturer technologies can play a role in demonstrating, in reducing peak loads. And similarly, looking into controls for improving mini split heat pumps to limit the use of electric resistance backup heating. To give you just one example of our work that we can dig into in a little more detail, we have a large demonstration in Spokane, Washington, at a place called the Eco District, which has a shared energy model. This is a project led by Avista with the help of McKinstry and others. P&L researchers have been deploying and testing novel building energy and energy management approaches that are going to be deployed in the Eco District, including some that we have been testing on our own campus for some time. The demonstrated technologies can all be deployed cost effectively in the field while delivering cost savings to building owners, occupants, and the utility. The buildings and the devices can communicate to one another and to the grid to make the best use of the existing grid without having costly construction needed to meet increased energy demand through electrification. So for example, the Eco District's air conditioning units have variable capacity rather than a simple on-off cycle. So when demand for electricity is high, they can run at lower capacity and utilize thermal storage devices or use energy stored in batteries or produced by on-site solar panels. The building automation systems will include using a P&L developed platform called Voltron, which has been commercialized by Eclipse, that can enable distributed sensing and controls in a variety of distributed generation frameworks. So this is one example of the type of work we're doing with these existing technologies using some of the novel integration tools that we have at the National Lab. But I encourage you all to kind of take a step back when you're thinking about all of these existing technologies in individual contexts and think about when we combine these all together, is our grid ready for this change? And I think that fireside chat we had earlier today got to a lot of the reasons why these are challenging questions. So with the types of questions that we're trying to address in the lab to get at this, I just kind of laid these out here to give you a sense of where these national resources are being used here. Can we do some analysis to determine if we have generation capacity that's adequate to switch transportation from oil to electrons? If we have energy storage in both centralized and decentralized locations, how do we optimize the role and the value of those different storage technologies, and how do we control them? Can we deliver clean and resilient energy equitably? That's a tough one. We talked about that earlier today. And what will the impact of this clean energy transition be on natural systems? And how will it impact our critical energy infrastructure and our energy consumption overall? So I'm going to leave you with a few other examples because I can't see my timing anymore. But this was an example that I was pleased that our keynote speaker talked about earlier. This is a new project called Energy Storage for Social Equity that PNNL is leading with Sandia National Labs. I would encourage you to look it up. This is a really unique program funded by the Department of Energy designed to empower urban, rural, and tribal disadvantaged communities to consider energy storage technologies and applications as a viable path towards community prosperity, well-being, and resilience. The goal of this project is to support disadvantaged communities affected by unreliable and expensive energy systems. And through the program, eligible communities will have access to direct non-financial technical assistance and potentially get support for new energy storage project development and deployment as well. That second part would come in phase 2. We just launched phase 1, and I'll show you a little bit more about the details of the program in the next slide. But I really want to hammer home why this is a unique program. It's easy to access. There's no technology experience required. Communities simply had to fill out an interest form and then can apply to work directly with a member of our team to fill out a more complete but still easy application. And the eligibility is really linked to need. The program is available to communities that don't usually have access or benefit from federal programs. It focuses on the problem with as many different possible solutions, and they'll have support from the National Lab engineers in understanding their energy challenges and co-developing a set of potential solutions and responses. The communities will also have the analysis of a relationship between the electricity system and other socioeconomic concerns, as well as support to do stakeholder identification and develop further relationships. The communities will be connected to one another and benefit from the lessons learned throughout the program. And again, they'll have an opportunity to have further support in phase 2. As I said, we just started this program a few months ago. So we're just starting phase 1 of technical assistance, which is where PNNL is leading. Phase 2 will begin in about a year, I believe, maybe a little bit less, which is where there'll be opportunities for demonstration projects, where Cynthia is leading much of that effort. Finally, I wanted to give you a little more information about some of the webinar series that we are launching at PNNL that are very much along the lines of, okay, what are the existing technologies? Where are there technology gaps? And where are there research questions about how to integrate these existing technologies into a full system? So we have launched this webinar series that's just been fantastic. It started, I think, in March, but it'll be going for the next few months, and there'll be plenty of opportunities for you to hear from some of the experts that we have in PNNL. So I selected these 2 upcoming webinars that I thought might be of interest. The first is one specifically around buildings and storage assets, where Srinivas Kadapumala will be presenting on some of the work that he's done in the space throughout his career, including that ecodistrict project that I just talked about. Srinivas is one of the nation's experts on this topic, on how buildings can be used as storage assets, specifically through the lens of commercial building and campus structures. And then later in July, we'll have a presentation on energy storage system controls, which I think will be a really key opportunity for people that are thinking about how to scale up in a highly electrified world, where Sarman Hanif and Diane Baldwin will be presenting. There are a ton of other webinars. These are the ones that I liked and I thought you might like too. So please check it out. Energy storage, I think it's back here, energy storage at PNNL, and you should be able to see what other webinars might pique your interest. And that's all that I have put together for all of you today. I don't know if I have any time left. Hopefully I do, but Chandler, I'll just hand the floor back to you and stop sharing my screen.
Thanks so much, Carmen. So we have about 12 minutes left in the panel. So hopefully we can get through about 3 questions that will be for all the panelists. But this has been a fantastic set of presentations. So if you remember, we started off with a presentation about electric vehicle charging and the importance of education from John Hallwell. And then we heard from Highland Fleets about school bus electrification programs. We heard from Brice Zoku about electric aviation and the first steps towards zero emission flights. And we heard from Jan Klock about marine electrification efforts. And finally, Karma just gave us a fantastic overview of efforts at PNNL to look at energy efficiency. So I think, when I think about all the presentations that we heard today, it's when I think to summarize them, it's a fantastic set of technologies and practices that are being developed around the world that Alaska can really stand to benefit from. And so the question I'd like to ask to the panel is, what are the major barriers that you see to bringing these technologies to Alaska? And in particular, are there workforce development pieces that we should be thinking about as a state? I know many of you are looking to bring some of these technologies here, so this is your opportunity to share the challenges that you see and what we can do as Alaskans to reduce some of those barriers. If anybody wants to jump in, go ahead.
I'll kick off the workforce question just because that's really top of mind for us at Highland, especially. EV charging infrastructure, building it is complicated. These projects are a lot of work to get these depots built at scale. But one thing that I think a lot of states and countries, frankly, the entire world is overlooking is O&M and maintaining these things once they're built. There are not enough people out there that can help maintain and support these chargers for long-term contracts. So I know one of the things we're trying to focus on here, in addition to actually electrifying everybody's fleets, is to help with that workforce development and get people trained up and ready to support these projects, because we need to hire as many of them as conceivably possible. And I'm constantly reaching out to schools and basically anyone that could be feeding good talent into this program to try and get these folks trained up, because we really need them.
And we integrated into our service offering too is mechanic and driver training, but the mechanic piece is crucial.
Yeah.
Especially since we're taking the financial risk on the maintenance. We have a vested interest in partnering with local organizations to expand the workforce.
Yeah, we certainly don't want to remove any work from mechanics, even though these buses do require less, I'm going to call it gooey work, of, things leaking and whatnot. They still require work. They still need to be inspected. They still need to be safe. And we want to make sure that all of the mechanics and staff at these schools are trained up on this latest gen tech and are continued to be trained throughout the life of the contract, so that they gain valuable knowledge and skills, along with the school district getting EV school buses and giant mobile batteries.
I would just add to that. I think that crosses over into the light duty space as well, that maintaining charge stations for EVs, that certainly call it reliability, uptime, how often you can show up at a charge station, plug in and be successful, that number's not been near where it should be. And it just takes diligence. And so that's going to take trained people that know electronics, that know electricity, to maintain the system. That probably extends into auto dealerships. Like I mentioned, training sales staff, but also the maintenance staff. I don't know how many shade tree mechanics are going to work on their EV. So we need to have that, the maintenance capability.
Over here, you can charge your car at work. Yeah, that's encouraged. Most workplaces have electric chargers for the employees using the cars. So at our main office in Burgin, we have 5 charging points, and here in where I sit, we've got 2. So if you've got an electric vehicle, you can charge it at work.
We've actually started to run into at the school bus depots, when drivers arrive to take the electric bus out for their route, they'll actually park their personal EV in the bus spot. And we already have a customer that's saying, hey, can they charge their personal cars on the bus charger? And we have to say to them right now, technically, yes, but we need to figure out how this all gets worked into the contract. But it's amazing how fast we're already starting to see that ramp of, yep, the buses are electric. Oh yeah, and the driver's car is electric too, and they all need to charge. So another fun advantage of electrifying the bus fleet is you also happen to get chargers that can charge the other vehicles the rest of the day.
Yeah, the ferry terminal we are doing in Denmark, they also have charging. They have fast chargers and they have slow charging, and they're even looking into putting up their own windmill to have a sustainable idea of the electric costing in the market. So they are very, very futuristic, these guys running this ferry company.
Another question that's come up in several contexts throughout the set of presentations was related to, a lot of the presentations here are focused on battery storage systems and electrical systems. And in particular, I think for the marine and aerospace applications, there's interest or the questions surrounding what role hydrogen will play in those industries in the future, as well as in the building space. And what sort of, if we're thinking about, can we think about like the type of range that would make sense for batteries in these applications and what type of ranges hydrogen might make more sense in the future? So that's really, maybe Reese could start us off there.
Yeah, I think hydrogen, looking at its specific energy density versus where energy density is for batteries, is certainly alluring. I think that there may be some hangups from at least our perspective. Again, we really look at kind of a risk managed approach. One, the generation of hydrogen isn't necessarily clean, although there's a lot of investment going in to kind of green that hydrogen generation. Local generation and kind of renewable local generation at airports has been discussed a lot recently. Second aspect of that is the infrastructure for hydrogen. I think is also needs to be developed. That's going to take time, and it's also going to need to be regulated by the FAA. The FAA will have has a whole section of the 14 CFR, the federal code for airports in particular, and how airports should be regulated. So I don't know that that's necessarily run to ground yet. So for us, trying to kind of maximize speed to adoption, and I'll just mention price is the last one, but maximize our speed to adoption. That's why we looked at hybrid. That's what we looked at battery, and maybe even battery for fully electric clean sheet designs long term. But if all those investments going in by governments all over the world into hydrogen, we've seen a lot in Europe and the UK. We've architected our technology such that we can actually transition to hydrogen once it's ready as a viable and economical fuel source. And you did ask about range. One thing, battery electric probably won't be, talk about clean sheet design, probably around 200 nautical miles. Hydrogen certainly allows you to potentially go farther. You also have to consider the amount of volume that it takes up on board. But there is that potential to have the longer range flights with hydrogen.
Thanks. And to Jan, you mentioned this is the longest, I think, transit for electric ferry right now is 2 hours and 40 minutes. Can you put that in terms of kilometers for us? And then also the range that you're looking at with your hydrogen vessel? I think you said 10 hours, but what would that be in kilometers?
So it's all depending on the load of the vessel. So the hydrogen, the one with the hydrogen fuel cells, if it slows down, it can do the 10 hours. It can't do it at 16 knots. The crossing we're talking about in Rødby is 26 kilometers. And to touch upon the hydrogen question, the discussion here is should you have a large fuel cell with a smaller battery bank, or a smaller fuel cell with a bigger battery bank, so that you could you're not going to get away from batteries on ships with hydrogen, because they don't regulate very well, and the argument is it's better to have a smaller one and let it run a lot rather than starting and stopping it and then conserving the energy in batteries and then use it throughout the day or in the operation. And it's also what we call the short sea arena where you could use this. I don't see it any time soon on what we call deep sea ships, transatlantic. I don't see it coming there any time soon. On ferries, on small passenger things, and maybe some of the wind farm vessels that can do it, but not going to Asia and the US on big container ships, not yet.
Thank you. I'm going to keep moving forward here with another question. So Dr. Anjuli Firon started us off today with her keynote speech addressing equity. And she brought up both exposure to pollution as well as affordability of energy. And this came up in your presentation as well, Karma. So I'm wondering if you can kind of build on the equity piece a bit more and how some of these new approaches and technologies can result in a more equitable energy system.
Well, what we're learning through the Energy Storage for Social Equity program is that building a relationship and really listening to community members is foundational to figuring out how to answer that question. So it's going to be unique. And I think that might be one of the, to your first question about what might need to happen in Alaska, you have disparate populations. And I think building relationships and building trust with those populations to help them understand their energy needs and their environmental justice needs in a way that can provide productive technical assistance support back to those communities is foundationally, and it's hard and slow and something that engineers are not trained at. And so I think we need to acknowledge that and kind of work through the difficulty. And then we'll see.
Thank you. I think it's a really important point to building these relationships and taking the time and acknowledging the challenges to that. I think that we're out of time here. I'd love to keep this discussion going. I feel like we could talk all day, but I'll pass it back to Michelle to take it away.
Thank you very much, Chandler. That was awesome moderation. And thank you again to all of our speakers in the last session and for today. What would a workshop be without unintended small mistakes? And we've saved the biggest one of this workshop to the last. We had some challenges getting, we had a recorded video coming from the governor's office, from the governor, for this event, which is a lead up to the conference being put on by the administration. And unfortunately, we had some communication issues. So we are going to go ahead and play the short, what was meant to be an introductory video right now. So apologies that it is wrapping up the conference while having some wording meant to introduce the workshop here. But we will play that and we will come back and transition into our ending. So thank you very much for your attention.
Good morning. Governor Mike Dunleavy here to welcome you to the first virtual workshop hosted by the Alaska Center for Energy and Power. My office is very thankful to Gwen and her team for all their help organizing these events in the advance of the Alaska Sustainable Energy Conference later this month on the 24th through the 26th in Anchorage. We have a great lineup of speakers at that event covering all forms of renewable energy along with nuclear and natural gas and how we combine all these new technologies in our vast state and variety of electric grids. I hope to see you all there. One topic we'll be covering at the conference at the end of the month is what you are here to learn about today, electrification. Electrification has a very important part in the clean energy future. It can reduce our consumption of non-renewable resources because of the greater efficiency of technologies, such as electric vehicles and heat pumps. The benefits expand when that electricity is produced from renewable sources, including air quality, which, as we know, is a long-standing goal in places such as Fairbanks. The energy landscape in Alaska is highly unique. We have vast renewable resources, but they can also be uneconomic to develop due to the small local electric loads of our islanded microgrids. These conditions lend themselves well to increasing the use of electricity locally, which can bring down the cost to make and deliver a unit of electricity. The electrification of the local heating and transportation loads will make development of stranded renewable resources near rural communities much more economical. It can also enhance local resiliency and energy self-sufficiency. ACEP is leading the way in Alaska, and I want to thank them again for putting on this workshop and all the staff's help with our Sustainable Energy Conference later this month. Enjoy the rest of today's agenda.
Thank you, Governor Dunleavy, and apologies for showing that video at the end instead of the beginning of this workshop. But that has highlighted some future opportunities, which is that the Sustainable Energy Conference is coming up at the end of near the end of this month. And I've been monitoring the chat. I haven't been able to respond. So please, if there are questions there, and there are some directly for some of our speakers and some of a more general nature, please go ahead and enter there and respond. But I've noticed that there's a lot of interest in technologies in the chat other than electrification. And this conference will be of a more general nature as opposed to the specific topic of electrification today. So that's an opportunity to learn more about many types of resources for this energy transition and to discuss how they will all play their part. So again, that's coming up at the end of the month, and the link to register is in the chat. So thank you everybody for your participation today. We hope to stay in touch. I'm sure with everything happening, this will not be the last opportunity for us to come together and discuss beneficial and equitable electrification in Alaska and the other amazing topics that have been brought up today. So thank you. The recording of this webinar will be available on the Alaska Sustainable Energy Conference website at www.alaskasustainableenergy.com virtual workshop at a later date. please continue to check back for more information on this. We'll also be sending out a short survey following the workshop. Please give us your feedback. We'll also drop it in the chat right now. We hope you enjoyed the workshop. We hope this content was valuable to you. Please take a minute to complete the short survey to help the planning community to improve to improve future workshops. So I very much appreciate all the incredible behind the scenes work from government events, from our wonderful moderators, from the panelists, and from all of you attendees. You've had some excellent questions in the chat. Apologies of the virtual format that there can't be more direct interaction, but it's been great to follow that. Coming up, be sure to check out the upcoming Arctic X Summit that's happening in person on May 23rd in Anchorage, Alaska. Visit energy.gov/ArcticX to register and for more information. And of course, we hope to see you all at the Alaska Sustainable Energy Conference at the Denina Center in Anchorage, May 24th through 26th. So both in-person and virtual tickets, as a reminder, are available. Please consider joining us, and you can purchase your tickets at alaskasustainableenergy.com. So with that, I release you to enjoy the rest of your day or to get a bunch of work done. And again, really appreciate this opportunity to spend some time with you. Thanks, everyone, and goodbye.